The Shamans of Mexico, Book 1, by JACOBO GRINBERG Silverbaum, 1987. Preliminary Note by Bending Realities. The Shamans of Mexico is a landmark work by Mexican author and psychologist JACOBO GRINBERG, published in 1987 as the first volume in a series of 7 books. Born in Mexico City in 1946, Grinberg dedicated his life to the study of the human mind, perception, and spirituality. Trained in psychology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and studying neurophysiology in New York, Grinberg sought to unite modern science with the ancestral wisdom of Mexico's indigenous cultures. His mysterious disappearance in 1994 only added to the mystique of his research and the validity of his texts. In The Shamans of Mexico, Grinberg documents his experience of living and learning with shamans from different regions of the country, exploring their rituals and spiritual practices. His objective in this work is to reveal how shamanism allows the expansion of the perception of reality and provides a tool for self-knowledge. In the current context, characterized by a deep spiritual search and a renewed interest in ancestral knowledge, this research is especially relevant as it reminds us of the importance of this knowledge in a world that tends to lose its roots in favor of technology. The audiobook, in addition to capturing Grinberg's anthropological observations, is filled with personal accounts and unique experiences of the rituals he had access to, many of which are rarely shared with outsiders. One of the most curious aspects of this work is that Grinberg was able to observe millennia-old practices firsthand, documenting shamanic experiences that would otherwise have remained a mystery. It is important to mention that the translation of this audiobook into English has been carefully done by the Bending Realities team, who have dedicated themselves to preserving the authenticity and original tone of Grinberg's work. Thanks to their work, English-speaking listeners can immerse themselves in the cultural and spiritual nuances of the author's stories, feeling the intensity and respect with which he approached the traditions of the shamans. This first volume of the series, The Shamans of Mexico, opens a path towards a deep understanding of an ancient wisdom, inviting us to reflect on our perception of reality and the role of ancestral knowledge in modern life. With this audiobook, listeners can connect with JACOBO Grinberg's unique vision and enter the world of Mexican shamanism as a gateway to self-knowledge and spiritual expansion. Introduction. One of the saddest and most disturbing attitudes of today's Mexicans is their tendency towards self-evaluation, possibly as a result of a brutal conquest characterized by a total lack of respect for their autochthonous values, which conditioned them to think of their own as worthless and the external as omnipotent. It is enough to observe the gigantic lines that form in front of the recently inaugurated McDonald's, or the predominant preference that exists in Mexico for saving in dollars with North American banks, to realize that Mexicans do not trust their own nation and that they continue to let themselves be conquered by foreigners. And the most extraordinary thing of all is that such an attitude of submission exists in a country like this one, where some of the most developed people on the planet live. I am referring to the men of knowledge of Mexico, the native shamans and psychologists. Since time immemorial, each tribe of the ancient inhabitants of Mexico was commanded spiritually by one or more men who stood out for their intelligence, intuition, and clairvoyance. At least since the Toltecs, these men of knowledge began to found lineages, by means of which, through a chain of successors, they transmitted from generation to generation their particular way of creating reality. The number of lineages that currently exist in Mexico is undetermined. Although it is known to be abundant, many of them survived the conquest. Others were encircled after it. They are found in almost every town, county, or city, and form a subculture of unsuspected complexity and wealth. They are dedicated to curing illnesses, predicting the future, giving advice and alleviating anguish. They are consulted by entire villages as they find guidance and consolation in them. Their intuitive capacity is generous, and their initiatory vocation is even more so. They are the spokespersons of millenary traditions and represent the truest and most mysterious roots of Mexican culture. Some perform almost miraculous feats of intuition and knowledge, and almost all enjoy an enviable willpower and optimism. They fight against sorcery and consider themselves defenders of the underdog and the weak, and it is precisely in the spirit of rescuing the knowledge of these men that we have initiated a nationwide investigation, with the conviction that a people that possesses such an extraordinary human wealth as Mexico has no reason to feel devalued, and that what happens, perhaps, is that we do not know and ignore what we are. We hope that this research will help us to reevaluate ourselves and to trust ourselves more. With this intention in mind, we are committed to disseminating the findings of this research. As for the methodology used in this project, participatory research was considered the most appropriate. The researchers lived with the shamans, underwent their teachings, and in some cases became their disciples. In this way, it was possible to obtain accurate first-hand information about their practices and teachings. This methodology also made it possible to test some of the therapeutic procedures used by the shamans. In some cases, interviews were conducted with the patients and disciples of the shamans, and the effects of their teachings and therapies were followed up exhaustively using audiovisual equipment. This work required constant travel and long stays in the communities where the shamans live. Finally, I would like to mention that the results obtained so far support the postulations of the synergistic theory. This theory holds that perceptual reality is the product of the interaction between an energetic field activated by the brain, the neuronal field, and the structure of space-time, the quantum field. The interaction of the two fields creates an interference pattern that permeates all of space. Conscious experience arises when the observer focuses a hypothetical mechanism called a directionality factor on some portion of the interference pattern. Shamans seem to possess great mastery in focusing their directionality factor, being able to activate different experiences at different locations in space and levels of reality. Chapter 1, Part 1. The first meeting. The shamans of Mexico are grouped into different lineages, according to their techniques, procedures, and their particular conception of reality. Among these lineages is that of the graniceros of the state of Morelos, who are dedicated to the management of atmospheric conditions in order to prevent storms, hailstorms, or frost from destroying the crops of the communities they protect. Don Lucio Campos is one of the directors of the Graniceros de Morelos lineage. For Don Lucio, reality is divided into two large sections, the visible world and the invisible world. The visible world is the reality of objects, bodies, and physical and material conditions. The invisible world, on the other hand, is the reality of the beings that live in space, the workers of time. According to Don Lucio, a shaman of his lineage can come into contact with the workers of time if he is chosen to do so. The manifestation of the choice is an event of terrible proportions, consisting of a lightning strike on the candidate's body and the candidate's survival. Don Lucio himself was struck by lightning more than 30 years ago, after which he became a shaman. As such, Don Lucio is dedicated to healing members of the community who request it. In addition to his work as a healer, Don Lucio is a teacher and guide to a group of disciples who visit him. Once a year, on May 5th, this shaman, along with members of his lineage and his disciples, performs a ceremony in El Coleca, a cave located between the Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl volcanoes. In this cave, Don Lucio asks for the power to face storms and hailstorms successfully. Don Lucio's daily life is spent as a Morelos peasant, dedicated to the care of his cornfield, his animals, and his home. Married with several children, Don Lucio affirms that his work as a shaman must maintain a healthy balance and a seamless integration with his life as a husband, father, adult, and farmer. Don Lucio dedicates a special place in his home to his altar, where he practices his healing arts and shamanic teaching. It was through a friend that I learned of Don Lucio's existence. My interest in the study of relativistic conceptions of time made me go in search of him. The following is an account of my first encounter with him. One afternoon I went to Tlayacapan. I did not know Don Lucio's address, so I decided to let my intuition guide me. At the height of a barn, I recognized a strange hut, and thinking that Don Lucio lived there, I explored it. After that and another failed attempt, I decided to ask my friend for Don Lucio's address. My friend, an anthropologist, expert in shamanism and experimental filmmaker, informed me where I could find him. I left Tlayacapan, and on the way a terrible storm enveloped me. Some children made me hesitate to continue on my way, and that made me meet Don Lucio in his truck on the road. I met his family anyway. His wife, a beautiful Indian woman of advanced years, impressed me by the purity of her features, with wrinkles that emerged from her eyes in a lateral direction. The same wrinkles that Don Lucio has. 2 days later, I met Don Lucio again. I left Mexico City in the morning, and at the time of the appointment, I was just at the lookout point in Cuernavaca. I felt tired and in a bad mood. After dozing for a few moments, I suddenly felt the need to leave. I started the car, and in less than 6 minutes, I was already in Tepoztlán. Something happened, because at the speed at which I was traveling, that trip takes 12 or 13 minutes. It seemed as if a force had swallowed me up and then deposited me in Tepoztlán. Later, Don Lucio received me kindly, offering me a small chair in his room of altars and offerings, full of images of saints and crosses placed in the center of a table. After greeting each other and asking about my origin and place of residence, he smiled openly and asked me, "What can I do for you?" I felt obliged to explain my intentions. I told him about my work and my conviction about time as a gateway to wisdom. After the explanation, I kept silent. Don Lucio rested his chin on the palm of his hand and, squinting his eyes, meditated for a few moments. At the end, he turned to look at me and said, "Time is very important, but learning from it is very difficult and expensive." I felt an incongruity. I could not mix the economic with the spiritual, and even less so when it came to an Indian. I was raised by an Indian woman who, when my mother died, took her place in the house. I knew the beauty, purity, and honesty that hides the soul and heart of an Indian. Don Lucio's reference to how expensive my apprenticeship was going to be left me confused and alarmed. However, there was something in his face that did not coincide with the monetary factor. Don Lucio was probably testing me. When I came to that conclusion, I calmed down and told him, "Well, you say, and we'll see if it is enough for me." Don Lucio threw a MMMH, and after meditating for another moment, he abruptly changed his tone. "It takes a lot of enthusiasm," he said softly. "And besides, the risk is high. The weather people are very hard, and there are no roads there." I thought I had heard wrong. Don Lucio was talking about people of time and mentioned a specific place where they lived. I thought perhaps he was referring to another plane of existence. "Where do these people live, Don Lucio?" He smiled again with an expression of seriousness mixed with mystery and irony. "I know what I'm talking about, Jacobo. I lived with them for 3 years, and it's not easy." 3 years? I asked in astonishment. "Yes, sir," Don Lucio answered me with conviction. "I was with them for 3 years, and they taught me what time is. My enthusiasm increased every moment. I think if I had met Don Lucio a few months earlier, I would not have believed him. But I already accepted the reality of other planes of existence. I want to know more, Don Lucio. I don't care what I have to do. Besides, I accept the risk." Don Lucio looked at me again, and an expression that I interpreted as confidence appeared on his face. Again he seemed to meditate for a moment before speaking. "I see that there is enthusiasm and strength, and that is what is needed. What I want to know is what your intentions are." My intention was to know and to fly literally. However, I didn't know how to explain it. On the other hand, I had dedicated my life to writing, and with each new book I felt I was bringing something positive to man. That's what I let him know. Adding a comparison, "You dedicate yourself to healing, Don Lucio, because you know it is good, and with it you cooperate to human welfare. I write for the same reasons. My intention is to know more and share my knowledge." very good," said Don Lucio sweetly. "I see that there is nothing wrong. I think I can do something. I will summon the spirits," he no longer called them gentes, "and tell them that he wants to talk to them in order to gain wisdom." That sounded excellent to me. I needed to talk about my ideas, and there was no one better to understand and instruct me than spiritual entities. I thanked him, and also made him understand that I wanted to go that way alone, without depending on anyone. "The only thing that will be necessary to do," said Don Lucio abruptly, "is a ceremony in which I will give light." At the end I asked him if time management allowed me to travel from one place to another. "In spirit, yes," he replied, "but not in body. Time can stop, speed up, or slow down, but no one can travel with his body in it." On Tuesday I went to buy all the necessary things for the ceremony and took them to Don Lucio. He checked the candles, the mole, the flowers, the fruits and the candies. Afterwards we sat and talked. "I was talking to them," Don Lucio said seriously, "and they asked me what I was going to do with the knowledge they give him." "I am going to write, Don Lucio," I said. "Well, they say that there will be things I can't write, and besides, they want to know what you will do with the profits from your books." I must confess that I was disappointed. No one except my own conscience had the right to decide what I would write. On the other hand, the profits would be absurd, because no matter how many books are sold in Mexico, if the publishers agree to publish them, the profit for the author is always ridiculous. I let Don Lucio know this, adding that I did not accept impositions with respect to what I wrote, but that I realized the care and respect I should have in doing so. I mentioned that I understood that some things should not be said, and not to worry. Don Lucio seemed convinced and asked me what had happened to me since we last met. I told him about the difficulties I was going through, and told him that I had the feeling that I was being tested. "Above all," I added, "there is someone I am meeting in unexpected places." An elderly gentleman with a very strange face had crossed my path so many times that it could not be a coincidence. Don Lucio seemed concerned, and asked me several questions about the man's characteristics. In the end, he told me that he would see him on his nightly tour. "If he is theirs," he said smiling, "they will bring him to me, and if he is not theirs, we will see what he wants." When I said goodbye, he explained to me the reason for the candles he had asked me for the ceremony. He said that by lighting them, he would be able to tell, by the size of the light, the response of the spirits. At first he had asked for 6 candles, but this time he doubled the amount. "It is because the thing is more serious than I thought. 12 are needed for the apostles," he said seriously. He also asked me for alcohol and cigars. The reason he gave me was that people of all ages would be at the ceremony. Alcohol was needed because when these people lived in the world, there were no drinks like today's. For the children, he asked me for chocolates and cigars. For the children, he asked me for chocolates and candy. On Thursday, I arrived 30 minutes later than agreed. Don Lucio's grandson greeted me by name, and his grandfather explained that before the ceremony he was going to do some work in the bush with one of his disciples. I decided to accompany him, and after walking a long way, we found ourselves in a small esplanade surrounded by farm fields. 2 or 3 meters from the place where Don Lucio's disciple had felt the onset of his illness, there was a tree damaged and burned by lightning. This seemed logical to Don Lucio. He lit copal and began the cleansing ceremony, which included several stages. First the copal, whose smoke Don Lucio spread all over the place. Then he covered the mourner with flowers and poured alcohol on him. Finally he spread lemonade in all directions, and with 2 palms in his hands, he chased away and untangled, as he later said, the spirits that had taken possession of his pupil. On the way back, I asked him if he could see the spirits, and he answered with, "Of course he could, if not, how else would he be able to heal?" We finally arrived at his home. While we had attended the Limpia, Don Lucio's wife had placed the flowers, fruits, and candles on the table. Don Lucio explained that the illnesses of his disciples were also his, and therefore he had to cure them and take care of them like his children. The ceremony began with the lighting of the candles. Don Lucio saw the flames, and according to their height and color, he made expressions of contentment or concern. Then he made the introduction in front of the assembly of spirits, saying that he recommended me and emphasized my enthusiasm, good faith, and intentions. Don Lucio kept seeing the flames and announcing that everything was going well, that I had no problems, and that I had been accepted. Later, we sat down to eat, and I began to ask him questions. Does reincarnation exist? Do people of time reincarnate? Is consciousness acquired or deposited in a body? Don Lucio laughed at the questions and answered one by one. Reincarnation does exist, he said solemnly. Time workers never return, and consciousness is given. We then discussed a Tibetan prophecy that mentioned Mexico as the starting place for a great change of consciousness. The change has already begun, said Don Lucio, and it will be very great. He would not tell me how or when it had begun, but he told me the story of the grandfather of the disciple he had just cleansed. He was a very good man, but lightning had a way with him. Lightning struck him 3 times, and the last one killed him. He became a laborer, for lightning always goes with lightning. Now his grandson has a job, but he has let himself go, and that is why his illness came upon him. We continued talking for several hours, and at the end, we agreed to meet on Monday to talk about our experiences. We said goodbye, and Don Lucio wished me all kinds of good things. Don Lucio and his grandson shelling corn. The following is an account of Don Lucio's impressions of Gretchen Otterson, who in 1985 joined the research on the Shamans of Mexico. Gretchen Anderson is a researcher specializing in indigenous cultures in the United States. Much has already been written about the shaman Don Lucio, and in fact, from the first visit I made to him, I confirmed much of what I had previously read and heard about him. I found him to be a man who greeted his visitors warmly, and who was deeply knowledgeable in his view of life and reality. Life apparently goes on as normal for this hard-working farmer who daily toils in the fields of his village, and emphasizes to those who visit him the importance of providing bread for the table, especially in these increasingly difficult times. But not everything he talks about is so commonplace or practical, as he also stresses our spiritual obligations and our connections to an invisible world in which we interact with beings from other dimensions or other levels of existence. He is a balanced man and shows how the practical considerations of everyday life harmonize with a world of mystery that very few of us have experienced or understood. My first encounter with Don Lucio was in a group. I was impressed by the rigorous questioning to which he subjected each visitor, delving into some key part of his life, while apparently making simple comments. He gave the impression that there was no part of our lives that we could hide from him. After this introductory phase, he spoke of our current times and what the future would bring. Describing a pessimistic outlook, he spoke of our present inability to cure common illnesses that until recently had been curable in a simple and effective way. A cold now is simply not the same as it used to be. You can't cure it with an aspirin and lemon, he observed, warning us of the economic and health problems that lie ahead, but at the same time he seemed to allude to our current social ills that have no known cure. He offered a possible solution to this crisis by mentioning a man to come, a man of great power and wisdom, whose destiny would be to help us through the difficult times. It made me think of apocalyptic visions of the coming of a savior, and another person present compared him to a modern-day Emiliano Zapata. It seems that Don Lucio, at 71 years of age, has not yet found a disciple or heir who can continue in his place, nor has he found a person with whom to share his visions. Not even the priests who have visited him have been able to speak of the flocks, or the shepherds who take care of the flocks. Many have come to visit him and to learn, but so far they have not gone beyond the limits of intellectual understanding, where notes are not taken with pen and paper, but written forever inside their heads. Thus Don Lucio frequently repeats, "Put it here," as he writes invisible words on his forehead. Here they can never be lost or forgotten. He told me of one such visitor, Dora from New York, who came to talk with Don Lucio and share what she knew of healing methods and time control. After several meetings, it seems that Dora's questions kept increasing, and on one occasion, Dora finally asked Don Lucio if there was a written book containing all this information that she could read. He replied that yes, of course there was, and gave it to her to read. Laughing, she told us that when she tried to read it, she ran back, protesting that it was written in Greek. Here, Don Lucio paused mysteriously to look at us, to see if we had understood the joke, and then continued laughing. According to Don Lucio, Dora still had a lot to learn about the control of atmospheric conditions, since he had had to teach her something as elementary as the production of clouds and lightning. He illustrated this point by saying, "You send the lightning like this," and with this he made a magnetic-type gesture with his hands. "And then you shout to Emmanuel from Popocatépetl to send a little cloud in this direction." He continued with Dora's comments, and how he happily bid her farewell, convinced that she knew very little of these matters. As I listened to this story, I was aware that much of what Don Lucio told us was not explained by his words alone, but by every movement and every gesture, and that his intention in telling the stories was not to entertain but to give us some message as well, the understanding of which depended on our perceptual capacity to comprehend it. Are we all the same, Don Lucio? Is the person observing the one who sees the same thing in all of us? One of the group asked, and in the conversation talked about who we are, and about other worlds. Don Lucio answered the question by first saying that we were all different, each one with his special way of being and doing, but that the one who sees everything the same. We are all the same in body, in mind, in essence. However, at the same time we are different. The idea became clearer when he said that we all come from the same origin, from the same divine breath, according to him. The differences between us exist because of the gifts that have been given to each of us. These gifts are what make us the way we are, what design the kind of life we lead. They are given, controlled and guided by beings such as shepherds and time workers. Don Lucio explained that the time workers exist in a world physically similar to our own. There are women, children, babies, big people. However, there is one important difference, and that is that their world exists in perfect harmony and peace. He explained to me that there were the time workers before and the time workers after. It seems that we have all been time workers before this life, and that we can become time workers again afterwards. When I asked Don Lucio what his next task would be after this life was over, he replied that he would do whatever the Lord asked him to do, and made no reference to what that might be. We talked briefly about these things, and although there were still many more to explore and many more questions to ask, we decided to wait until the next visit, as Don Lucio was tired. Before we left, Don Lucio gave each of us a cleanse, or as I prefer to put it, he gave us one of his gifts. The smell of herbs and alcohol pervaded the room, as Don Lucio repeated his blessing to each of us, patting us on the head, back and chest with his special liquid, and blessing our hands for the work we would be doing later. Don Lucio had been ill lately, so we cut short the visit to allow him to rest, thanking him for the time and energy he had shared with us. Part 2. A Shamanic Initiation. As we have already seen, Don Lucio Campos lives in a small town in the state of Morelos. More than 30 years ago, he was initiated in the art of healing and controlling storms and hail, in order to ensure that the crops in his region would not be damaged. One day, While tending his cows in the field, Don Lucio saw a multicolored sphere approaching him. As he tried to catch it, he lost consciousness. When he recovered, he realized that he had been struck by lightning. He returned home, and his wife was surprised by its burning smell. 8 days later, when he was back in the field, he began to see small beings calling him. The next day he stopped eating and began to lose interest in daily life. Frightened, his wife tried to cure him, but without success. Gradually he began to slip into a coma and remained so for 3 years. Don Lucio says that while his body remained unconscious and artificially fed, his spirit was awake and receiving teachings which were given to him by the weather workers, spiritual beings in charge of maintaining the atmospheric balance of the planet. During the first year of his teaching and initiation as a shaman, Don Lucio traveled with the weather workers throughout the length and breadth of the earth, as they taught him how to control storms, deflect hailstones, and shoot lightning. During the second year, Don Lucio was trained to recognize medicinal herbs and was instructed in the art and techniques of healing. The weather workers, these ethereal beings, according to Don Lucio, are part of herds that are distinguished by their colors. There are white, yellow, green, black, and other colored flocks. Each one of them represents a nation and a state of consciousness. Don Lucio considers Mexico to be the white herd because of its capacity to be in the being or center of consciousness. Each flock, in turn, is commanded by a shepherd who guides it and is in charge of its development. The shepherds are commanded by the shepherd of shepherds, to whom Don Lucio attributes divine functions. After visiting all the flocks and meeting their shepherds, Don Lucio arrived at a magnificent valley in the center of which was the shepherd of shepherds. The latter received him and congratulated him for having come so far in his development. The shaman asked him to continue learning, and the high shepherd indicated a path. Don Lucio took the path and arrived at 3 mountains, beyond which there was no road. In this place, this shaman received his last initiation, which consisted of learning to distinguish good from evil and the knowledge of human conduct. Later, the shepherd of shepherds ordered him to return to his physical body and use what he had learned for the benefit of suffering humanity on earth. Don Lucio did as requested and is dedicated to this day to healing and protecting the crops of his people from storms and other mishaps. A group of disciples has formed around Don Lucio who learn to use medicinal herbs and other therapeutic techniques. Don Lucio uses the limpia to reorganize the body's energy and the vistas to diagnose. The limpias are performed with the help of farm eggs, which, when rubbed against the body of his patients, absorb bad energies. The views are obtained by depositing these eggs inside transparent glasses filled with water. Depending on the protein forms, bubbles, yolk disposition, etc., Don Lucio makes a diagnostic interpretation in which references to spirits and works done by envy and hatred are not lacking. Some of his disciples are crowned by this shaman. The coronation is an initiatory ceremony that places the aspirant as a servant of time. This is a human category, one level below the etheric one of time worker. The weather server is able to heal and manage atmospheric conditions, guided by one or more protectors from among the weather workers. An example of an initiatory process was related to me by Don Lucio himself. Gobi, an American girl living in Taxco, was spotted by a flock of weather workers. One of these spirits was attracted to the girl. This worker requested permission to become Gobi's protector and guide. Permission was granted by the Lord, who had previously ascertained that the worker's intentions were directed towards the girl's perfection. The worker, in the form of a cloud, went to look for Gobi, finding the unpleasant news that he no longer lived in Taxco. The aspirant was located in the United States, where she had gone on a visit. The worker waited for Gobi to catch a plane back to Mexico, and 5 minutes after takeoff, he fired a bolt of lightning at the aircraft. This lightning struck the aircraft near where the girl was. The plane managed to land, and Gobi boarded another plane to continue his journey. Again, 5 minutes after takeoff, the weather worker fired another bolt of lightning at the plane, striking the window where Gobi was standing. The aircraft wobbled but continued on its journey with a dizzy and almost unconscious Gobi. Arriving in Mexico, the young woman was still feeling sick and called a friend, who took her to Don Lucio. The latter, understanding what had happened, crowned Gobi and informed her that her protector had given her 2 gardens, the gift of healing and the power to handle the atmospheric elements. This incredible initiation is not common. Although having received an electric shock, lightning is considered among veteran servants as a sure sign of election by the weather workers. Don Lucio claims to be able to detach himself from his body and in spirit work in time by traveling the planet and doing good works. The spirits tell him when a patient will come and recommend medicines and healing and therapeutic procedures. Once a year, on May 5th, Don Lucio, along with his disciples and members of other servant lineages from the state of Morelos, gather in a cave located between the Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl volcanoes, El Caleca, where they receive strength to be able to confront the forces of evil and thus help their communities. It is interesting to discover that there are similarities between Mexican shamans and those of other latitudes, such as those of Siberia. According to Mircea Eliade, Siberian shamans are also initiated by lightning, and some are dedicated, like Don Lucio, to healing and defending their communities against adverse weather conditions. We find ourselves, then, in front of a peculiar development of consciousness, no less real and significant than the Western consciousness, so concerned with material conditions and so far removed from spirituality. In contrast, the lineages of servants of the time of the state of Morelos maintain a close link with purely spiritual orders of reality. Don Lucio himself distinguishes 2 worlds, that of visible objects and that of invisible beings. The latter, according to him, is a world of work, without hatred, discrimination, or prejudice. Everyone in it works in works of goodness. Therefore, when Don Lucio was ordered to return to his body on earth, the first thing he felt was that he was being sent to hell. He was, in fact, about to refuse, but he remembered who was asking him to do so, the Shepherd of Shepherds, and he agreed. Ceremony in El Caleca, on May 5th, the initiation of Don Lucio. What follows is the almost literal reproduction of the story of Don Lucio's initiation into shamanism, narrated by himself to the author, during a conversation held in the altars of his house. An account of this type requires, in order to be obtained, the trust of the shaman, and this is only achieved after passing through tests of intention. In this case, Don Lucio even allowed the reproduction of his story. I found Don Lucio playing with his newborn grandson at the end of a small wooden table where the rest of his family was eating. Laughter mingled with the humid vapors of the temescal, surely prepared for the recently delivered mother. They welcomed me as if I were another member of the family and made me join them. I had come from Tepoztlán, and suddenly I felt that Don Lucio's town was much more my true home. Don Lucio's grandson looked at me, placid and relaxed, while his grandfather, almost deaf, told me that God had blessed him again. I felt an almost unbearable inner fire and had decided to come to visit Don Lucio for advice. He seemed to understand my urgency and invited me to the next room, where a table full of statuettes and candles served as an altar next to 2 small wooden chairs. We sat across from each other, and Don Lucio noticed that his red candle had broken off all its kerosene through a crack in the glass vessel that held it. It cracked from too much heat, he told me with a smile. I understood it as a reflection of the fire that was consuming me. Don Lucio looked me in the eyes, and I felt it pierced me. You have to conserve yourself, he told me with seriousness. In these times, evil is on the loose and tries to get in, but one must reject it to stay high. Nothing should make you fall, and with God's help everything is fixed. I liked his words. They were an accurate reflection of what I felt, and I thanked him for them. After a moment of concentrated silence, he continued, "It's like the other day. You see, even the weather reflects the other, and tries to leave us without harvests. I saw from one cycle a black cloud like a whirlpool, and I realized that from the 4 directions came the same clouds, all swirling and whirling. I said to myself that this was very serious, and that a great battle was going on up there in the sky. I took my light and put it on the right side, and on the left side I lit my charcoal and prepared to smoke. I sat in the middle of both at the door of my house, and prepared to repel those beings. It began to hail, and look, Jacobo, in an instant the earth whitened. I got strong and sent them up, and there they went. Fast as they had come, they could be seen heading towards Tepoztlan and Zempoala, the damned ones. I could not hide my joy, I laughed, and with pure pleasure, I patted Don Lucio, who did the same as me. It's the same with people, I said offhand, astonished at my own words. They try to get into you like clouds, and you need to keep out of the way. That's right, he replied, showing me his left hand. Do you see these fingers? For with them I learned to direct the lightning. The sudden change in the topic of conversation caught me off guard. I was asking myself a question that had not had time to rise to the surface of my consciousness, but which, after Don Lucio's observation, appeared clearly. Who were the beings behind the clouds? I posed it to Don Lucio, and he looked at me in surprise. Well, what haven't I told you? Maybe, but I don't remember anymore, I answered shyly. Ah, gee, Jacobo, well, here it goes. Look, the other day in the field a strong tree with a very wide trunk was pulled out of the ground, roots and all, and overturned on a compadre's wheat field. They called me to go and see it and give my testimony. The tree had been pulled out of the ground by a very strong hand and left at a distance from its origin, healthy, without a sign of damage, complete with all its branches. I knew that this had been done by the weathermen, who were very strong and worked together. I also did those jobs when I was with them. And how did you come to be with them? I asked, eager to go back to another story. Well, what I haven't told you, man. Look, he continued decisively. One day I took my cattle to graze in the bush. I was there at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when suddenly I turned to the sky and saw a ball made of gores of all colors coming at me very fast. The ball was shining, and it was so beautiful that I stretched out my arms to try to catch it. I was trying to catch it when suddenly everything went black. At about 5:30 I woke up on the floor, not knowing what had happened. I ran to see my cows, and when I touched my head I felt it wet and without a hat. I was surprised by that and went back to look for my hat. I saw that the pasture where I had been was flattened, and suddenly I remembered what had happened. I was scared to death because I understood that lightning had struck me. I ran to my cattle and ran into a friend. I told him that I wanted to take shelter in my house for fear that the lightning would find me again. My friend laughed at me and told me that even in the house it could happen. I understood that he was right, and I was satisfied. After all, it was the same everywhere. I sat down on a stone to contemplate the countryside. The sun was shining beautifully, and I felt good, but I was hungry as hell. I had never felt so hungry. I got up and arrived home. My wife was pregnant with my first child, and I didn't want to tell her anything so as not to scare her. I asked her to help me take off my raincoat, and she came over and smelled burning. Well, where is that smell from? She asked me. I didn't say anything. I ate as if in desperation, but that was the last time I did. From that day on I didn't want to eat any more, and after 15 days I was all bones. I became deathly ill, Jacobo, and they had to carry me from one place to another because I couldn't even walk. I asked them to let me die in my bed and not to walk me around anymore because I was ashamed. They took me to doctors, to healing centers, and nobody knew what was wrong with me. I spent 3 years of my life like that. My body was dead, but my spirit was detached and was with those of time. I knew many things, Jacobo, and I traveled through flocks of all colors and their shepherds. Hey, Don Lucio, I interrupted, where are the beings of the flocks from? Don Lucio's expression changed. He stared into my eyes as if wondering if I was serious, and then patted me on the back, laughing. What do you mean, where are the herd beings from? He said, laughing. What happened, Jacobo? What happened? Where is your head? Yes, man, we are the herds. What, don't you know? Wow, I felt sorry, although the questioning was still inside me. I looked inquisitively at Don Lucio, and he seemed to guess my doubt. He cleared his throat and continued. The colors are various: white, yellow, then gold, black. Let's see, Jacobo, where do the colors come from? Well, I don't know, Don Lucio. Oh shit, where is that head, man? Look, the whites are us, the Mexicans. The güeros then are the Americans. The golden ones are then the Germans. I thought the blacks were the Americans, Don Lucio. No, man, what happened? What happened? We are all equal and even more among the people of the time. Over there we work in equality, although the colors still exist. What do they work on? I asked curiously, feeling like a little boy in front of a huge and wise old man. Now that's nice, Don Lucio said with a smile. There are many jobs. Well, what haven't I told you? The first year I was working with the weather. I walked with the herds from one side to the other. There, in 1 minute, you walk from Mexico to the United States. We watched the clouds and the lightning, and went around the world watching out for and changing the course of the storms. Look, see this hand. From the fingers came lights to move the lightning. The second year I was working the land. I learned to recognize seeds and to plant and harvest. Today I know how to take care of corn, wheat, beans, broad beans, everything that can be planted. The third year I got to know all the herds and their shepherds. As I told you, the herds are of all colors, and the first of them is white, and that's us Mexicans. I had been at a meeting in Tepoztlán in which an archaeologist, Alexander von Wuthenau, had defended the thesis that Mexico had been visited by men of all civilizations long before Columbus. I had asked him if that meant that the present Mexican was the product of the mixture of all those races, and he had said yes. The white light is the mixture of all the lights, and that coincided with what Don Lucio was saying. I let him know, and he answered me saying that Mexico was the center. That's right, Jacobo. Mexico is the center, and that's why they visited us so much. We have that light. I had just returned from India and Nepal, and Don Lucio's observation reflected my own opinion. The Mexicans seemed to possess contact with the very control of consciousness, especially the Mexican from the countryside. For that very reason before, we could not stand foreigners. We felt them far and strange from that center, and that was very difficult for us, Don Lucio told me with conviction. That center, I added, is the greatest treasure. It is from there that one can feel the infinite. Every instant is new and at the same time the same. It is from there that one can heal, and everything acquires meaning. That's right, said Don Lucio, patting me on the back. I see that you understand me. And for that reason come one day at dawn, and on an empty stomach, so that you can have the testimony of the colors of the flocks. That is very important to know, very, very important. Obviously, the invitation seduced me, and I told him that I would come on a Saturday to give testimony. I reminded Don Lucio that he was telling me about his encounter with all the flocks. He cleared his throat and continued his story. I walked among them, and so one day I came to a very large valley, where all the herds and their shepherds were gathered. The mountains were full of them, and everything looked very beautiful. In the middle of the valley was the shepherd of all the shepherds, sitting on a rock with a very long white beard, and a staff on his knees. I was on the edge of the valley, and when the herds felt me they made their way. I walked among them, and little by little I approached the older shepherd. When I reached him, he looked at me and picked up his staff. He welcomed me and told me that I was there because of God's will. He asked me if I wanted to continue to the end of the road, and when I said yes, he pointed to a path and told me that after walking along it I should return to where he was. So I continued walking until I came to a mountain that was blocking the path. 2 other mountains on either side guarded a small valley. To the left, a cross with Christ on it looked down at me. Jesus was there without nails, of his own free will. On the right were 3 chests and a lookout. I approached the first one, and the guard asked me if I wanted to see inside. I said yes, and he opened it. A crystal clear water was there fluttering quietly. A few drops splashed me, and one fell on my forehead. I understood that it was the liquid of good. The second box contained an ashy, cloudy liquid, and it also swirled and fluttered in swirls. Were you splashed by that water too? I asked. Yes, also, and then I was told that the third box was terrible, and that if I wanted to I would not be shown it. I refused, and the lid was opened. A terrible whirlpool threw it into the air and I could see inside. Horrible animals lived inside. Frightful snakes were crossing with frogs, and their poisonous mouths were coming out of the surface of a very dark liquid trying to bite me. After seeing all that, I went back to the senior pastor. He welcomed me back and told me that everything had been shown to me because that had been his will. Now, he continued, it is my will that you return to your place of origin, and there receive all these flocks, and lead them to the light, and clear them. I felt myself dying. After 3 years of being in glory, I was being sent back to the hell of the earth. In spite of my displeasure, I accepted my mission, but I asked the shepherd that his presence accompany me in my work. Not only that, he replied, you will also have the help of the spiritual world. I returned, then, to this world, and one evening I told my wife to saddle me a little donkey. So she did, and I rode on it and went to the country. I found a meadow by a tree, and there I lay down. I got up after a few hours and returned home. My wife received me, and little by little I healed myself with the help of the field. The older shepherd also allowed me to collect my cures, and give me time to cultivate the field to support my own. One day a man came to whom I had helped. He offered to give me a position in Social Security in Mexico City to do my work. I said no. I just looked him in the eye and told him that I didn't want to become like one of them, but rather that I wanted to remain responsible for my work. He insisted. He told me that he had a lot of influence, and that it was just a matter of me signing some papers, and that would be enough to secure me for life. So what happened? I said again, and I refused again. He got angry and told me that I would not even accept the gift. Then I realized that this is my place, and here I receive the people from the flocks. Sometimes priests come and I ask them about their flocks, and they do not understand what I am talking about. Do me a favor, if they do not understand, then who does? A priest always comes to me to ask for my blessing. Well, that's a big one, me giving my blessing to a priest, and when I ask him why, he tells me it's because he always does well when I bless him. Now I take care of the fields and I keep away the evil beings that want to destroy the crops, and I tell the farmers to go and bless their rockets and make them thunder in the air every time a bad cloud comes, and they do it that way, and everything goes very well. You, Jacobo, come and give testimony whenever you want. I'll be waiting for you here. Don Lucio preparing to do an eviction. Psychophysiological correlates. I do not feel qualified to judge to which reality the experiences that Don Lucio lived during the 3 years of his initiation as a shaman belong. What I am able to do is to establish a parallelism between them and the organization of the brain. This parallelism exists, and the work of analyzing it is fascinating. This means that the reality that Don Lucio lived is reflected, and that it is a reflection of the organization and functioning of the human brain. Obviously, this parallelism is not exclusive to the brain simply because its organization is a reflection of other orders and levels of nature. In fact, the way in which information is organized in space is the same as that which is reflected in the organization of the brain. This implies that Don Lucio's pattern of experiences is isomorphic with respect to the brain, space, and other orders of nature. For the purpose of this analysis, I will recapitulate some of Don Lucio's key experiences and describe their psychophysiological correlates. First, the concept of herd and shepherd. Don Lucio describes the existence of herds of all colors commanded by shepherd guides. Regarding the cerebral counterpart of the flocks and their shepherds, it is known that the cerebral cortex is the most evolved of all brain structures, and that it is made up of functional units that are repeated throughout the length and breadth of its three-dimensionality. These units are complex circuits that interconnect cortical layers through interneuron fibers. The encoding of the information that travels through the cortical units undergoes complex integration processes. In them, activity patterns are reduced to neural algorithms through the activation of inclusion circuits by convergence. An example of this inclusive processing is the activation of a complex cortical cell as a result of the convergence of information coming from simple cells of the same cortex. Other examples are the activation of polysensory cells of the parieto-temporal cortex as a result of the arrival of neural impulses from many sources. What I am implying through this description is the consideration that a highly inclusive algorithmic pattern by convergence could be considered as a neural model of a shepherd, while the set of functional units feeding it, the neural algorithm, would be its flock. The concept of a shepherd of shepherds also has a cerebral counterpart, but it requires, to be understood, some preliminary considerations. If the shepherd of shepherds is the integrator of all the flocks, his function must be that of unification and coordination of the more or less differentiated flocks. In the case of the brain, a measure of the greater or lesser functional differentiation between different cortical regions is coherence. When there is a high coherence between two areas of the cortex, this implies a high redundancy in the handling of information of the units involved, and a high flow of information between them. Conversely, low coherence implies a high level of differentiation in the information handled by the neurons. The particular energetic flows between units located in different cortical regions determine not only different unifying algorithmic patterns of their activity, but also different associated sensory qualities. The differentiated colors of the flocks could be associated with these global characteristics. Coherence is a measure of similarity. On the other hand, coherence studies have shown that the occipital cortex has the lowest coherence and the frontal cortex the highest. The high coherence of the frontal lobe and its connections with the rest of the cortex through long axonal fibers can be conceptualized as if this pole of the most recent brain evolution acts as a general coordinator of the state of differentiation or coherence of the rest of the brain. The similar situation must be associated with the function of structures of high informational convergence, such as the parieto-temporal cortex or some subcortical structures, such as the caudate nucleus. The high convergence and unifying power of the parieto-temporal cortex explains its functioning as an area of assigning meaning to neutral stimuli, and it could be conceived as a neural model of the shepherd of shepherds of Don Lucio's Shamanic Initiation. It is possible to suppose that when the coherence of the whole brain increases, thus unifying its activity, subjective experience must follow suit. In a recently completed study, it was found that high inter- and interhemispheric coherence correlated with an internal state of unification, balance, and contact with the self. In contrast, when coherence decreased, the associated feeling was one of lack of unification and lack of contact with the self. The arrival at the I normally occurs after a subject, in the process of normal development, has gone through a series of experiences and has integrated them, finding what they all have in common, that is, that they are experiences included within the same subject or consciousness. In psychophysiological terms, the ego emerges when the process of neuroalgorithmization and the assignment of meanings has reached a level at which the incorporation of new data no longer alters the structure of the final algorithm. Anatomically, this must involve a development and activation of convergence coding circuits and a decanting of complex neural patterns until full algorithmic management of brain activity is achieved. I have already described this process in greater detail above, so I will only add here that it must involve learning to control the overall coherence of the brain. Ideally speaking, a subject reaches optimal development when he succeeds in maintaining a differentiation of experiences on a constant background of ego integration. In other words, when he is himself in any situation and in the face of different experiences. In his initiation, Don Lucio seems to have reproduced this process from his encounter with each of the flocks and their shepherds to his knowledge of the shepherd of shepherds, or central integrator of all the flocks. His vision of a valley filled with all the flocks, and the chief shepherd seated in the center, seems to be a global vision of all the functional units of the cortex and the frontal pole, orchestrating the activity of the whole. This view suggests that Don Lucio's journey was a journey through his own structures and an encounter with himself. Without this context, the transformation made by Don Lucio's consciousness, perceiving the cortical units as herds, of his algorithmic patterns as shepherds, and of the activation of a polysensory and maximally convergent brain structure as the shepherd of shepherds, is a product of Don Lucio's peasant upbringing and of his concept of reality associated with his environment. It would seem that the lightning that struck Don Lucio modified his entire inner workings, causing his consciousness to penetrate areas of himself that generally remain blocked and inaccessible. However, Don Lucio's insistence on the external character of his journey must be taken into consideration, as well as his ability to exert control over the storms. In this sense, there is a theory that postulates that the brain is capable of creating an energy field, the neural field, that radiates from the brain structure, leaves it, and enters the extracranial space. Here it interacts with the energetic matrix of space-time, giving rise to a hypercomplex interference pattern that constitutes the energetic structure of the experience. According to synergistic theory, the interference pattern is decoded and transformed into conscious experience by the observer or self through the mediation of a directionality factor. The latter interacts with limited portions of the interference pattern and transforms them into specific experiences. Since there is no theoretical limit to the expansion of the neural field in space, and therefore the interference pattern permeates both the inside and the outside of the organic structure of the brain, the directionality factor may be able to transform any interference pattern inside and outside the brain into a record. From this point of view, Don Lucio was able to decode extracranial zones of his interference pattern, thus experiencing levels of reality unknown to the rest of us. The description of timelessness during his travels and his ability to move from one geographic location to another without appreciable intervals is in agreement with the above, because precisely one of the characteristics of the directionality factor is that it is possible to focus it in different regions of space-time without appreciable temporal intervals between each of its locations. In this sense, conscious experience has a quantum behavior. According to the synergistic theory, when the directionality factor is able to focus on the observer, the resulting experience is that of the self. Correlatively with this experience, it is possible to demonstrate the existence of a remarkable increase in interhemispheric coherence. Probably the latter occurred when Don Lucio was able to see all the flocks together, with the shepherd of shepherds at their center. Finally, the control that the graniceros claim to exercise over clouds, lightning, and storms could be related to a master control over the directionality factor and the interaction of energy fields in the structure of space. Chapter 2. Doña Pachita from Mexico City and Parral. When we move an arm or utter a word, we do not need to be aware of the neural patterns we need to activate to perform the movement or verbalization. We simply desire the action and it appears. Between the desire and its satisfaction, there are automated levels of coding. In other words, a series of preordained circuits are set in motion, and the correct and precise emission depends on their automatic activity. Generally, our physical body is the only instrument that our psyche is able to control in a relatively direct mind-matter interaction with a minimum of latency. Some of our shamans, however, have learned to expand the aforementioned interaction to targets outside their physical body. Although the evidence for the above leaves no doubt as to its veracity, the mechanism involved is still a mystery. Personally, I had the opportunity to directly observe the work of one of the greatest shamans of our country, Doña Pachita of Mexico City, and to verify not only her ability to affect matter with her mind, but also to use this ability to perform miraculous surgical operations. Barbara Guerrero was Pachita's birth name. I met her when she was about to turn 80 years old, but she still showed enviable strength and power. I met her at a meeting to which I had been invited with the Lázaro Cárdenas residents at Los Pinos. A week earlier, Margarita López Portillo had been introduced to me, and after a conversation about the state of Mexico's conscience, she invited me to that meeting. The room in which we were meeting was large, sunny, and full of huge cages, with birds brought from all regions of the country, which remained placid and in relative silence. Suddenly and in unison, all the birds began to chirp, and the volume of their sounds added together deafened us, making us turn in all directions, trying to find the reason for such a resounding event. Next to the entrance door to the hall, a stocky, short figure with a friendly, laughing gait was entering. There was no doubt that the birdsongs were related to that woman, who, humbly dressed and covered by an old sweater, approached us smiling. It was Pachita, and the birds of Mexico must have welcomed her. I was transfixed by the event, and could not take my eyes off this woman, who seemed to me more and more beautiful and profound. Pachita sat down on a chair in front of Margarita, and without any preamble questioned her. "Why are there so many taxes, Margarita? Can't you see that the people are starving?" I noticed that Margarita's expression changed, and that she looked as I did, at the ragged sleeve of Pachita's sweater. I later learned that Pachita had dressed on purpose in her oldest clothes. López Portillo answered her in a whisper, "I swear to you that I have nothing to do with taxes, but I promise you that I will tell my brother." Afterwards, we were served coffee. A butler in a frock coat holding a tray approached Pachita and offered it to her in a porcelain cup. She looked at it mockingly and said in a loud voice, as if making sure we could all hear her, "Bring me café de Allah." The message was clear, and I began to admire Pachita and wanted to get to know her better. As if she had heard my thoughts, she approached me and invited me to come see her at her house the following week. I have already described in 2 books what I saw in Pachita's home the first day I went to see her, and what I continued to observe during the months I had the privilege of working at her side. Here I will only give a brief summary of my experiences. Genealogy. The origin of Pachita's lineage is totally unknown. There is some indication that the work performed by this shaman Nahuala was also performed by some of the Aztec princes, including Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor. The reasons for supposing this will be seen later. There is evidence of work similar to that performed by Pachita, engraved on the stones of Ica, discovered by Dr. Cabrera in Peru. These evidences inscribed on the Ica stones are highly speculative, but suggestive that the origin of the skills manifested by Pachita goes back to a very distant past of mankind. Pachita claimed that her lineage was passed from generation to generation through direct kinship. In this way, Pachita claimed that after her death her work would be carried out by one of her sons, who in turn would inherit it to a daughter, and so on, until 10 generations were completed. If the assumption that the origin of the skills of this lineage is remote is correct, one would have to question the conception according to which we are currently in a state of technological surpassing with respect to the past. In other words, Pachita's work, as we will see shortly, was so extraordinary, technologically speaking, and if its origin is remote, we would have to assume that our ancestors had knowledge that we do not know despite the apparent technological advancement in which we live. Personal history. Pachita was born in the city of Parral, state of Chihuahua, in the north of the Mexican Republic, one day in December 1900. She was abandoned by her parents for being an illegitimate child, and adopted by a strange character whose name was Charles, of African origin and black complexion. According to a description made by Pachita herself to the author of this study, Charles dedicated himself to teaching her a series of healing procedures, energetic management, visions about the stars, and obtaining oracular information. Charles returned to his country when Pachita was 15 years old, and from that moment on Barbara Guerrero lived alone and on her own means. Pachita tells that she was unaware of her own healing abilities, and that on one occasion, while attending a circus that was performing near where she lived, in the north of the country, she came across a baby elephant that was very sick. Pachita approached this animal and cured it. From that moment on, she began her career as a healer. However, the time, 1915, was inappropriate for the open manifestation of these healing abilities, and fearing that people would consider her a witch and therefore persecute her, Pachita hid her abilities. She fought alongside Villa during the Revolution. She was a soldier. Later, she dedicated herself to different activities. She was a dancer. She worked selling lottery tickets, singing in the trucks of Mexico City, where she arrived at a date unknown to the author. As an adult, she openly dedicated herself to healing. He settled in Mexico City and began to receive the sick. Modalities of Pachita's work. The modalities of work of this shaman Nawala can be divided into 4 major categories. First, what could be called diagnostic work. Second, surgical work. Third is the management of space, matter, energy. And finally, initiatory or mystical work. I will attempt to describe each of these modalities in the following sections. Diagnosis. Pachita used different procedures, each with unparalleled mastery. One form of diagnosis was the visualization of the palms of patients' hands. Through the decoding of the shapes of the lines of the palms, their coloration, and aspects that were not possible to elucidate, Pachita diagnosed specific diseases. She located abscesses, tumors, ulcers, or infections in particular organs. Another modality was to touch with her hands areas of the body of the sick and, through some unknown sensory mechanism, detect diseases, infections, tumors, etc. in those areas and in the depths of the body. Sometimes I saw her use eggs that she rubbed against the skin of the sick to obtain information about the ailments they were suffering from. Pachita also had the subtle ability to diagnose some illnesses just by looking at the patient. These abilities even allowed her to detect patients from a distance and accurately diagnose their alterations and pathological processes. Surgical modality. Pachita's main activity was to perform surgery on her patients. The operations were performed in a small room dimly lit with several candles and decorated with an altar of 7 steps in which paintings and statues of Cuauhtémoc, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and other saints could be seen. The operations were carried out in one of the corners of the room, on a small wooden bed on which was placed a rubber foam covered with transparent plastic. The patients were laid down on this improvised bed, and once the part of the body affected by the disease was discovered, one of Pachita's assistants would wet a cotton ball with alcohol and rub the liquid on the skin. Afterwards, Pachita would ask for her instrument, which was a bush knife, approximately 15 centimeters long. Taking it with her right hand, she would locate the incision area, and without preamble, she would introduce and open it. The incision was generally large, with a consequent natural hemorrhage. The patients generally complained and manifested pain, although not comparable to that which could be expected without, as was the case, the application of anesthetics. In other words, the patients were not anesthetized, nor were they given lightening substances that would explain the absence of internal pain when Pachita made the incisions with her knife. Some mysterious mechanism, however, dulled the pain. After the incision, the knife was introduced inside the body. After a quick maneuver, a tumor was extracted. A piece of an organ was cut out, or tissue was simply put in its place. I had the opportunity to follow up several patients operated by Pachita for tumors. I remember, for example, the case of 2 American women who had been diagnosed in New York with tumors near the womb. After the operation, in which I was present, both patients went to my house to recover. This allowed me to see the results. In the incision area, there was a small scar, resembling what could be a tiny scratch. 2 years later, on a trip I made to New York, I was able to talk to these 2 patients of Pachita's, and they confirmed that their tumors had disappeared after the operation, and that they had not had any discomfort or sequelae afterwards. Pachita performed organ transplants. In cases where a patient arrived with a serious alteration in one of his organs, for example lung cancer, Pachita, with her bush knife, opened the skin, cut the ribs using a vernacular plumber's saw, extracted the affected lung, and then performed the transplant. The transplanted organ was sucked strangely from inside the body, and after making a characteristic noise, as if blowing up a balloon, the incision was closed, and the patient was placed in recovery. After the operations, patients were bandaged in the treated area, and for half an hour they rested in the same room or operating room in which the intervention had been performed. According to Pachita, this period of rest served to balance the body's energy fields in order for the patient to recover. The patient was then helped to return home, where he or she was to remain for 72 hours in absolute rest. Transplants were multiple. I saw dozens of lung cases, at least 4 kidney cases, and other interventions that I describe extensively in my book about Pachita, Grinberg Zilberbaum, 1980. Sometimes the organs for transplants were provided by the patients themselves, who obtained them from a morgue. Other times it was Pachita who, by means of a materialization, made the organ to be transplanted appear. These materialization operations belong to the third modality of Pachita's work, that is, the management of space-time, whose procedure I will describe next. In cases of surgical operations involving transplants in which the patients were unable to obtain the organ to be replaced, Pachita performed strange movements with her arms and hands in the air, after which a tissue usually appeared and was used for the transplant. Pachita performed materializations on a daily basis, and without paying much attention to them. She was able to alter different levels of organization of space in such a way that this transparent space underwent a change in its fundamental structure, giving rise to an object. I had the opportunity to see this dozens of times. One day, Pachita even handed me something she had just materialized. It was a small oval-shaped coppery metal frame with glass, containing a tiny oil painting by an unknown artist named Tilo, and also extraordinary handling of space matter was performed during the operations. For example, the use of the bush knife was almost symbolic. The knife was not really used as a scalpel, but it seemed that the contact of its tip with the skin was enough to open it. Similarly, when wounds were sutured, neither thread nor needle was used, but a similar handling of the space matter that, in a way, made the opening undergo a process of inversion, and what had previously been opened, now closed by itself. All situations of surgical management, diagnosis, or alteration of the structure of space were accompanied by a particular mystique, with which Pachita continually made reference to God, the Father, and a series of entities that were familiar to her. This brings us to the fourth modality of her work. Initiatory or mystical modality. Pachita claimed to be unaware of the mechanism by which she carried out her work. She even claimed to be unaware of what her body was doing during surgical interventions or during the handling of space matter. She said that all these maneuvers were performed by her protector, who introduced himself into her body to handle her matter and perform the miraculous interventions without Pachita's normal consciousness. About this consciousness, Pachita said that she felt it was located in a kind of garden, resting, while her body was handled by her protector, who performed the operations. Pachita's protector was Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor. He would appear at the moment when the surgical work began, when Pachita would sit on a chair before starting the operations. She would close her eyes, take a deep breath, and after executing a series of strange movements, an alternate personality would suddenly appear and introduce himself under the name of Cuauhtémoc. Several times she witnessed this trance in which Pachita transformed her personality. When Cuauhtémoc appeared, Pachita's voice would change, her body would show more strength, her attitude would change from a feminine to a masculine quality, her presence would become regal in the strictest sense of the word, and she would generally greet those of us who witnessed the metamorphosis by saying, "In the name of the Father, I greet you." Cuauhtémoc said that in his time, during his reign, the Aztec emperors like him, in addition to learning to direct the empire from the political point of view, learned to manage energy in surgical processes, similar to those I have described. Cuauhtémoc considered that his mission on earth had been interrupted by the Spanish conquest, and that Pachita, through her body, offered him the opportunity to conclude his work. Cuauhtémoc called this body of Pachita the sheath of matter, and spoke of it as if it were a suit or tool that he used directly to perform the surgical maneuvers and other modalities of work that have been described. The appearance of this alternate personality was always accompanied by an initiatory or mystical message, in which the existence of supernatural powers that guided the development of world events was mentioned. Cuauhtémoc said that he and a group of collaborators of his level performed works of planetary remodeling, planetary energetic balance, deviation of negative influences, and prevention of crises in one or more zones of the world. This last consideration leads us to question the concept of reality of Pachita and her lineage. Pachita's concept of reality, as we saw before, Pachita considered that, in addition to the everyday world in which she was a participant, there were alternative realities in which beings coexisted that had greater power and capacity to modify events than human beings. Pachita called these beings protectors and claimed to have one of her own, affirming that most of the beings who shared her work also acquired, as a result, a protector or spiritual guide. This conception of reality cannot be reduced to a single level, but rather considered on various levels, occupied and lived. Thus Cuauhtémoc, as an inhabitant of the spiritual world, and according to this conception, lived in the company of other beings of the same energetic category, with whom he worked and performed different operations, among which were the surgical ones, using Pachita's body as a medium. On another level of reality, these spiritual beings were, in turn, commanded by beings of another category, closer to what Cuauhtémoc called the Supreme Father or God. On many occasions, during surgical operations, when Pachita's body was occupied by Cuauhtémoc, he would take leave of his collaborators to go and consult the Father about the decisions to be made or about what maneuvers to do with his patients. Cuauhtémoc would say, literally, that he was going to ask Father, and that he would return after receiving instructions. In Pachita's concept of reality, there were at least 3 levels. The level of everyday human beings, the level of protectors, such as Cuauhtémoc himself, the level of the Supreme Father, who commanded the other 2 levels. Within this concept of reality, Pachita also incorporated the existence of another. This appeared and manifested itself when one of the sick was diagnosed as incurable. The appearance of death as a specific being was often accompanied by noises or words that came out of Pachita's own mouth. On occasions I heard Pachita mention the name of the prophet Elijah as a guide to her lineage. On others, I heard about other mythical beings that seemed to have a very close contact with Pachita's lineage. Parallel to the concept of reality described above, Pachita advocated a process of development of consciousness, which I describe below. Development of consciousness. Pachita considered that in the world there were at least 2 fundamental forces or powers that, at times, clashed in deadly and terrible battles. Light and darkness. For Pachita, light was synonymous with love, prayer, healing, good intentions, and healthy work. Darkness, on the other hand, was death, degeneration, deceit, dirty work, diabolical work, and witchcraft. Pachita spoke of the existence of illnesses caused by damages. The damages were sorceries caused by sorcerers who were paid to perform evil works on other human beings. The damages were recognized by Pachita by a characteristic smell or a characteristic attitude. When a damage was detected, Pachita announced that the next patient was a damaged patient and that therefore adequate precautions should be taken to work and intervene surgically on this type of patient. Generally, when a harm was announced, protective chains were made in which the collaborators held hands and formed a circle around the operative field. On other occasions, some collaborators would throw a balsamic liquid into the air, which, according to them, kept the patients away from negative presences that wanted to affect them. The development of consciousness for Pachita and her lineage implied overcoming the darkness and strengthening the light. According to her, all beings had as their primary motive the search for light, and this motivation caused all beings to engage in behaviors directed toward achieving positive states of love and healthy relationships with their fellow beings. Thus, the concept of the development of consciousness that Pachita defended implied the existence of an essential luminous center in each human being, and the need to activate this center, opposing any barrier that would hinder its manifestation. Pachita considered that the most powerful weapon was love and light, and that no matter the apparent destructive attitude of any being, it always traveled in search of light. Pachita's doctrine was, therefore, to increase the luminous states and to work for a greater existence of light and love in the world. In this sense, I attended at least 5 surgical operations in which objects and animals that represented the materialization of the damage were extracted from the body of the patients. These objects or animals were treated in a very special way. Pachita used to say that after performing a damage extraction operation, at night a deadly fight would be established between herself and the damage causer, who would appear to try to recover the lost power over her patient. I remember the case of a boy of approximately 7 years of age who was operated on at the Pachita clinic in Parral for a damage located near the heart. This child appeared accompanied by his mother, who complained about her son's misbehavior, destructive attitudes, and obscene language. Being in Pachita's presence, and after being diagnosed as having damage disease, Pachita decided to operate on him the following day. The boy arrived at the clinic with his mother, and they sat down in the antechamber. At a certain moment, one of the vans that was parked near the clinic unexpectedly lost its handbrake and started to roll in the direction of the child. An instant before the vehicle reached him, someone saved the little boy, who was immediately taken to the operating room for surgery. I remember that this child was dragged to the operating table and laid down on it against his will. After Pachita asked for peace for the little boy, the entity occupying the child's body replied that it would never leave him. Pachita wielded the bush knife against the little boy, who in a hoarse voice replied that he was not affected by the threats. When the knife was about to be introduced, the child began to scream for help. Pachita opened the chest, extracted a carbon-black rectangular object, and immediately closed the wound. At that moment the patient began to cry. Pachita took him in her arms and told him that he had finally recovered his whole self and that no one would bother him anymore. The child was handed over to the mother, who several days later presented herself saying that her son was totally transformed, that he had become a normal child, without behavioral alterations, without aggressive attitudes, and that he used the language that corresponded to his age. This case, like many others I was able to witness, indicates that Pachita had control over mechanisms that manifest themselves in objective and material forms, such as the objects located inside her patients' bodies. It is evident that these mechanisms affect man's behavior to a great degree, and yet they are still unknown to science. Perspectives. Pachita is rightly considered one of the most extraordinary women of all times. Her healing capacity, her handling of reality, and her control over alternate levels of reality will hardly be surpassed. An attempt to explain what Pachita did is necessary. although we know beforehand that such an attempt is destined to fail, because the phenomena that manifested themselves through her are too complex and unknown to be integrated into an adequate scientific conception. The inexistence of this conception, however, is not sufficient argument to invalidate the observations made with Pachita, which have been verified not only by this author, but also by other people who have been in contact with this woman. See Appendix. Pachita was capable of modifying reality to a total degree. She was able to affect energetic fields, bodily organizations, tissues, and physiological mechanisms, over which she exercised a power of transformation. How and by what means were these maneuvers performed? It is impossible to know. Probably Pachita had the ability to visualize a certain surgical event, and this mental creation was enough for the event to occur in reality. If this is so, Pachita somehow knew the laws of organization of space and matter and the relationships that existed between these laws and her own psychic processes. This possibility is one of many temptations to rationalize the process that occurred whenever Pachita worked with her patients. In this regard, I remember that on one occasion a thin, sad, weak boy appeared in the operating room with purplish skin, which was immediately recognized as a manifestation of intense circulatory problems. Pachita invited the young man to lie down on the operating table, and, without further ado, opened the chest with her bush knife. She then cut the ribs and inserted the knife, extracting the heart, still connected to the aorta, and the other venous shunts. Palpitating, he placed it to one side of the terrible incision on the patient's chest. During this operation, I was working alongside Pachita, and as I observed the heart beating outside the body lying there, I was so impressed that I repeated several times aloud, "My God, my God, my God, my God." At this manifestation of astonishment, Pachita tilted her head to one side and, calling one of her collaborators, said in his ear, but loud enough so that I could hear her, "Jacobo is still not one of us." Indeed, Jacobo did not yet accept what was happening before his eyes as a daily and possible reality, but still had the conception that it was extraordinary and impossible from the point of view of contemporary science and technology. This experience made me understand and allowed me to peek for a moment into Pachita's world, in which the miraculous reality was everyday, and the most extraordinary idea was immediately converted into factual reality through a mechanism totally unknown to me. The same sensation of impossibility and amazement before what I saw happen to me during the operations that Pachita performed on a 13-year-old girl who had been decerebrated during an intervention in a hospital in Mexico City. The girl was practically a vegetable. She had no sphincter control, did not speak, did not walk, and lived in a wheelchair, totally disabled. Pachita performed about 10 operations on her, trying to reconstruct the encephalic mass that had been destroyed by an overdose of anesthesia. I attended 4 of these operations, in which Pachita would open the skull, exposing the cerebral cortex, and then with her knife cut out a piece of the brain. She would then materialize brain tissue to insert it in the place of the damaged one, which she had previously extracted. The wounds caused in each of the operations were closed using an energetic procedure, which consisted of placing the hands on the wound and concentrating on the palms, as if they radiated a special energy. Every 15 days the girl, accompanied by her parents, returned for a checkup and no longer showed signs of infection or the alterations that usually appear after such a traumatic operation, but instead showed a remarkable improvement. Years later, I had the opportunity to visit the patient, who had grown into a young woman of 19. I was able to observe that the processes activated by Pachita's operations, although partially, were successful, since the girl, although she was able to control her movements, had a restricted vocabulary, understood practically everything that was said to her, ate on her own, manifested a constant state of joy, and with help was able to walk, These results show that what Pachita did had a lasting and positive effect on those who came to her for help and relief from their misfortunes. Conclusions: Pachita possessed almost absolute control over matter and energy. One possible explanation for this power is that her consciousness was located at the source from which reality is constructed. Somehow she knew how to modify that source, and therefore, the manifestations that arise from it. According to Pachita, there is a level of oneself from which everything is possible and is also possible naturally and directly. Pachita scolded me when I seemed to dissociate her reality from everyday reality. She seemed to tell me that until I accepted as natural what she did, I could not understand it. Her understanding was the fact itself. It was not necessary to look for sophisticated mechanisms or complex functions, but to accept that when you get to the source, everything is possible. Through a simple act of will, for Pachita, everything had a connection with consciousness. Everything was consciousness. The flash of the mind, located at the source of reality, was enough to materialize the desire. Pachita liked the synergic theory. Every time I transmitted to her the cognitions of it, she rejoiced. She encouraged me to continue thinking that there was an interaction between energy fields, and that the world of our visual images came from it. I felt that she saw the fields and their interactions, and that she could handle her focus not only with mastery, but with the certainty that comes from direct seeing. Pachita's mind was in union with the minds of her patients and collaborators. There is no other way to understand her power of knowing the other, nor her extraordinary feats of diagnosis. According to the synergistic theory, Pachita possessed a total power of managing the focalization of her directionality factor. This allowed her to make her experience appear in any location without having to move to it. On the other hand, her handling of the quantum field or space-time grid allowed her to 3. Hypothetical mechanism that focuses the consciousness in a zone of the interaction between the neuronal and quantum fields, making the conscious experience appear there. Materializing and dematerializing objects or transferring them, as if for it there were no distances or spaces of separation. In conclusion, Pachita was one of the most portentous human beings that ever existed. Her power allowed her to perform incredible feats. She was a seer who could perceive reality from such a perspective or level that she could see clearly what remained invisible to others. This ability to see made her able to diagnose with astonishing accuracy different ailments and illnesses. From his behavior, we can deduce that there is a level of reality from which it is possible to see. Appendix about Pachita. Among the many testimonies about Pachita's abilities is that of Mr. Ramón Mancia Tinoco, who, desperate because of his daughter's illness, went in search of the shaman. Impressed by Pachita, Mr. Mancia became her disciple and follower. For months he helped her in her operations and treatments. A profound connoisseur of Pachita's personality and work, he was invited to collaborate in this volume. For this reason, we present below the text he gave us about his experiences with the shaman, My Experiences with Pachita, by Ramón Mancia Tinoco. The following is, first of all, a synthesis of my experiences with Pachita, trying to be as faithful and objective as the case allows, and then I give an interpretation of the facts related, the deductions obtained from my experiences in the light of the calm that the years that have passed since those events have provided me. Background: I married Alejandra in 1975, and in August 1977 we had our first child, a girl whom we named after her mother, and whom we affectionately called Alejandrita. Alejandrita was a beautiful and smiling girl. She had blue eyes, white complexion, and brown hair, not to mention her attribute of a very sharp intelligence. However, something was wrong with her. Her muscular system was weak, so that she could not sit up on her own nor hold her head up. The doctor's diagnosis was fulminating. She suffered from a congenital disease called Wernig-Hoffmann disease, a kind of progressive muscular atrophy for which there is no cure, because scientists prefer to devote resources to researching massive diseases, such as cancer, instead of dedicating them to statistically rare diseases. My wife and I exhausted all resources to save our daughter. We consulted several neurologists in Mexico, as well as homeopaths and chiropractors. Finally, we traveled to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, United States, where, in March 1978, Dr. Manuel Gomez confirmed the diagnosis that in Mexico was given to us by Dr. Guillermo Turrent, and which I have already mentioned. In short, Dr. Gomez estimated that our daughter had 3 more months to live. That was how things were when, in April of the same year, my father-in-law introduced us to a friend of his, Mr. Mendez, who, aware of the problem, suggested that we consult one of his friends, Dr. Jose Rojas, a retired surgeon who had been dedicated to the study of extraordinary phenomena for years, and who also gave lectures on the subject. And Dr. Rojas was the conduit that led us to Pachita. The first time we went to consult her, Dr. Rojas accompanied us. My wife, my daughter, the doctor, and I went with him. We arrived at his house in the Arenal neighborhood, next to the Hospital de la Raza, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in order to get a ficha, since the consultation started at 4 o'clock, and the doctor had warned us that there would be many people forming a long line in the street to see her, which we did indeed find out. Pachita lived in a single house, more or less well-built, right across the street from the neighborhood market. The entrance to the house was a garage with iron doors painted white and lined on the inside with yellow plastic sheeting to block the view from the outside. Pachita's real name was Barbara Guerrero, and she was a woman of dark complexion, short and moderately fat. She would have been approximately 63 or 64 years old. She also had broken and dyed brown hair, used a cane when walking, and almost invariably wore an apron, a sweater, and thick flesh-colored stockings, of the type worn by people of that age. The first time we were in front of her, after Daniel, one of her assistants, let us in, I felt excited and hopeful. The consultations were very quick, 5 minutes at the most each, because there were many people waiting. In a few words I told her the girl's problem, although she had already sensed that the patient was Alejandrita, and she immediately began to dictate a prescription to Memo, her son and assistant. They gave us the prescription, Tres Coronas Sherry, in which we had to soak a certain herb, an oil with alum for rubbing all over the body, and red coral, which we had to obtain so that Pachita could prepare an ointment for her. She made an appointment for the following week. During the following days we followed Pachita's instructions to the letter. We even obtained the red coral, and I took it to her house out of office hours. When the date of the new appointment arrived, Pachita checked the girl again, who was still exactly the same as her illness. He decided to operate on her that same afternoon. This is where the extraordinary, the best known and least understood part of Pachita comes in. The operations. I do not want to use the term psychic operations because I feel that it does not adequately describe the phenomenon, and one runs the risk of drawing wrong deductions. For the rest, I am far from being an expert on the subject. I limit myself only to my experience. The operations were physical. The patients were opened from the part of the body that was affected with only a bush knife and 4 assistants, 2 on each side of a wooden table in order to hold the patient. Because the operations were painful and the patients were not administered any type of anesthesia, there were no hygienic measures on the operating table. They were simply not necessary. The tools used, apart from the bush knife, were a pewter basin where a liter of alcohol was placed, and a package of absorbent cotton that was soaked in it to form a simile of swabs, conventional sewing scissors, and a bottle filled with a liquid they called balsam, which had a pleasant smell. The operations were always performed by the light of 2 or 3 candles. The room was never illuminated by electric light. Upon my express question, the assistants told me that the reason was that the electric energy interfered with the energy, whatever it was, that Pachita used to operate. Who would have thought at that time that I would become the last assistant that Pachita had, and that I would serve her during the last months of her life? The little brother. Strictly according to Pachita's version of the operations, she was not the one who operated on the patients, but the little brother. She was referring to Cuauhtémoc, the Aztec king, or rather his spirit, who took possession of her body to operate on a patient. A few moments before any operation, Pachita would put on over her clothes an orange-colored garment, a kind of Aztec-style toga, which covered only one shoulder. Afterwards, in the room where the operations were performed, she would sit for a few moments on a wooden chair, close her eyes, as if in an attitude of meditation, and when she got up again, she would greet those present with, "How are my children? I greet you." Her attitude and demeanor were different, although her voice was the same. He spoke in a low tone, gentle and authoritative at the same time. The patient, in this case my daughter, was placed on the wooden table, the only cover of which was a transparent plastic tablecloth, and the operation began. Pachita opened the girl's thorax with the bush knife and put her hand in it, testing and removing organs. The girl immediately began to cry. My wife and I were witnesses to the scene, plus the 4 people who were there as assistants: Armando, Mr. Mesquiz, Mr. Villafuerte, and Candelaria. Of the 4, the ones who never missed an operation were Armando and Candelaria. If the consultations lasted 5 minutes, the operations at most lasted 10. Pachita released the knife, passed her right hand over the thorax, and it was closed again. She asked Candelaria for alcohol swabs, and put them on the girl's chest. The swabs were always stained with blood. At this point, I would like to remind you that she operated by the light of 2 or 3 candles, located not on the table but to the side, behind Pachita and 2 of the assistants. When we arrived home and checked Alejandrita's chest, we observed that she did not have any scars, but she had 4 small points geometrically placed on the thorax, 2 exactly on the nipples, and 2 where the ribs end, more or less at the level of the navel. They were like mini incisions or very open pores. 24 hours after the operation, they were gone. They closed on their own. The girl's condition remained exactly the same. There was no improvement. I understood that I had to get closer to Pachita, to get to know her and her medicine better. I began to visit her house alone and outside of office hours. The 3rd visit paid off. When I knocked on the door of the house, I noticed a white van parked behind me, with Pachita and her 2 sons, Memo and Enrique, in it. I begged her to let me talk to her. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She saw me so desperate that she invited me into her house, into the kitchen, where we ate together. Pachita was a woman out of the ordinary because of the great love she felt for others. She could perceive the pain of others and sympathized serenely. In response, she gave joy, hope, and peace. She was focused, quick-witted, and had an extraordinary sense of humor. I told her that Alexandrite had not improved with the operation she had performed. I told her the problem in detail, stressing that the girl was hopeless. She replied that her treatment would take several months, and that 1 or 2 more operations would be required. I was happy. I went back several more times, until I gained the trust and sympathy of the assistants, their children, and Pachita herself. On one of those occasions, I asked her to allow me to help her in the operations. She replied that I was not ready yet, but that I had her permission to go in and see them. I estimate that adding those I witnessed as an observer plus what I did as an assistant, there were no less than 150 operations in which I was present. At first I thought it was all fraud, that Candelaria, the person who prepared the cotton swabs, put bladders with animal blood into the bladder which, when pressed against the patient's body, burst, wetting the patient and splashing the assistants with blood. The day soon came when I was an assistant, and I myself prepared the absorbent cotton and put alcohol in the basin. Blood bladders, there was no blood. I did it dozens of times, looking for the trick. On one occasion, when I was already an assistant, shortly before starting the operating session, Pachita was putting on her Aztec robe, and around the table the other 3 assistants of the day were having fun. Memo, Mesquiz, and Armando. What they were doing was rubbing quickly with the palm of their hands the transparent plastic cover that covered the table. To my surprise, I saw how the area they were rubbing radiated a phosphorescent green light as they passed their hand over it. They could do it at will. They asked me to try it. I started to do it timidly, and did not manage to radiate anything. I was able to do it until my third session as an assistant. I was told that it was only possible to do it when Pachita was in the room. That the green phosphorescent light that could be seen when rubbing was the same energy that Pachita used to operate. To anyone who thinks it was only static electricity, I asked them to try it at home. One day, eating in the kitchen with Pachita, I asked her what religion she had. She told me that she was a spiritualist Trinitarian Marian, a religion perfectly known to me. Returning to the subject of the operations, the same sequence was always kept. First the eyes, then the head, then the internal organs, and lastly the spine. Those of arms and legs were intermediate between head and internal organs, but they were rare. Pachita did organ transplants. I had to witness 10 or 15 vertebrae transplants, something impossible for today's medicine. She would take them out with the tip of the knife, place the new vertebra with her hand, and then hit it with the wooden handle of the knife like a hammer to make it fit properly. One day Memo showed me a human eye that was kept on a plate in the refrigerator. I asked him first and then Pachita how they obtained the organs for transplants. The answer was the same. It was a friend, a surgeon from the IMSS attached to the National Medical Center, who obtained the organs from unclaimed corpses. I do not remember the doctor's name, but I met him months later at Pachita's house when he was visiting. On another occasion, I was helping Pachita during consultations, and I observed that some patients came in with an egg in their hand and handed it to him. Pachita would take it and begin to run his hand all over the patient's body and finally throw it into a bucket. At the end of the consultations, I could not resist the temptation and asked her why she did that with the eggs. She answered, "Oh, my son, it's not good for anything, but people ask me for it. What do you want me to do?" That same day she told my wife and me that many people brought her photographs, ribbons, and letters to ask for her help in attracting their loved one. Pachita respected people's beliefs and placed all the objects on the altar she had in the room where the operations were performed. It was a large altar placed on a large wooden table with images of Jesus and Cuauhtémoc in the center. Among the people I met and dealt with on different occasions at Pachita's house, and who can attest to what I have written here, are the family of Mr. Jesus Razo, with whom we are friends to this day, the Argentine singer Leo Dan, who before me was Pachita's assistant, the ranchero singer Laura Fierro, who was operated on by Pachita, Mrs. Margarita Lopez Portillo, who was Pachita's assistant, and Mrs. Margarita Lopez Portillo, who was Pachita's assistant at the time of her surgery. Margarita Lopez Portillo, who was present with me in an operation session, actress Lucia Gilmain, Mr. Thierry Curdsey, then executive of LaRousse. Regarding what and how Pachita used to operate, I have no doubt that she really had the ability to penetrate the human body with her hands, as if it were another dimension. I also believe that Pachita herself never knew how she did it or why she had that faculty. When I asked her how she did it, Pachita answered me, "I don't know, ask your little brother, he is the one who does it. I firmly believe in God, in the spirit, and in the spiritual." For me, Pachita used spiritual energy to operate. However, personally, I do not believe and never believed in the explanation of little brother Cuauhtémoc. I feel that it was the best explanation that Pachita found to give to so many people for so many years, placing herself as medium of the spirit of the Aztec king. Pachita passed away in 1979, approximately 6 months before my daughter Alejandrita, who passed away on November 3rd of that year. This does not mean that Pachita had no faculties. It simply means that God is above all wills. Chapter 3, Doña María Sabina de Huatila. The following writing does not pretend to be an exhaustive study of Maria Sabina, nor even a more or less complete analysis of her personality, activities, and powers. The author did not know Sabina well enough to attempt a serious study of her work. Rather, it is an attempt to share with the reader a concrete experience. Maria Sabina lived in Huatila, in the Sierra of Oaxaca. During her childhood, she became accustomed to ingesting the hallucinogenic mushrooms that grow abundantly in the Sierra during the wet season. A biologist named Wasson discovered her and made her known to the world. From that moment on, Maria Sabina acquired worldwide fame, but at the same time, she lost part of the power that the mushrooms transmitted to her. As with the author of this chapter, Maria Sabina was the guide of countless seekers who came to her in the hope of finding answers to their problems. This shaman possessed the talent of guiding, with the help of mushrooms, her temporary companions on the hallucinogenic journey into strange and fantastic realities. She also possessed the gift of seeing the inner state of those of us who had the privilege of knowing her. As the reader will realize, when reading this chapter, Maria Sabina showed the ability to establish a direct communication, that is, a communication that does not require the use of sensory channels. In the Psychophysiological Research Laboratory, we have found that direct communication between human beings occurs when there is a concordance between the variations of interhemispheric coherence of the brains of the subjects. The more similar the individual oscillations of interhemispheric coherence are to each other, the greater is the direct communication. According to the synergistic theory, this means that the neural fields radiating from the brains of the communicating subjects match in a congruent interaction based on similar individual coherence. In reality, and according to the same theory, the interaction between all neural fields and the structure of space-time forms a complex hyperfield within which we are all imbued. Maria Sabina could decode the hyperfield and differentiate from it the zones corresponding to the mind of each. Some time ago, Maria Sabina died, and all of us who had the opportunity to know her know that with her went one of the greatest shamans of Mexico. To know the level of consciousness from which this woman perceived reality is impossible. Only she knew it by living it. What each one of her disciples can do is to witness and share the experiences we had with her. Precisely for this reason, and as a posthumous tribute, I will try to describe what happened to a group of colleagues and myself when we went to visit her in Huatila. 15 years ago, reaching Huatila, in the state of Oaxaca, by land was still something of a feat. The road was under construction, and gigantic machines removing large boulders were everywhere, blocking curves and mountainous stretches. Huatila greeted us in an almost impenetrable mist. Everything was damp, including our clothes and belongings. We were traveling in a Jeep Safari, and in the middle of a street, a little girl came running up to us. She climbed up on the side of the vehicle, and in a cracked voice told us that her grandmother wanted to see us. We asked her name, and she told us her name was Maria Sabina. We all looked at each other in surprise. Maria Sabina, that was like a miracle. We had heard of her through Wasson's work, but we didn't expect her to come to us through her granddaughter, let alone want to see us. Of course, we agreed to the invitation, and in less than 30 minutes, we were at the shaman's house. We were invited into a room filled with sacks full of coffee and corn, among which we sat down to wait. A short time later, the old woman entered, accompanied by an interpreter. The interpreter, who was her son, told us that Maria wanted us to go on a mushroom trip with her. She invited us to go and get the mushrooms, and talked at length about what the experience would cost us. I remember he was so insistent about the price and monetary arrangements that I and my two friends and colleagues looked at each other doubtfully. After several hours of searching, we got a good portion of mushrooms. One of our companions, Roberto, was an expert and told us that some varieties served to increase introspective capacity, while others produced extraordinary sensory effects. The variety we had obtained belonged to the first genus, and therefore it was advisable to experience it at night. We returned to Sabina's house after walking a path that now, unlike the first time, seemed very long. We sat down to wait, while we watched the shaman's family. One of her grandsons, a boy of 12 or 13, accompanied us, was drinking liquor from a bottle and soon got drunk. That, coupled with the commercial management, filled us with disgust. We were there to live a mystical experience, and we were disappointed. In the evening, Maria Sabina arrived. She brought with her a zahumador with copal whose delicious aroma relieved our discomfort and apprehension. Afterwards, the shaman approached each of us and rubbed our forearms with a dark powder. Later, she invited us to eat the mushrooms after she did the same. I carried a notebook with me and prepared to write down my experiences, while my companions, lying inside their sleeping bags, mocked my academic spirit. After 30 minutes, my intention to write began to fade into perceptual distortions and mixed emotions of joy and fear. I decided that writing was not important and crawled into my blankets, which seemed more like a cocoon than a makeshift bed. As I closed my eyes, images appeared. Later, these transformed into bodily sensations of discomfort. It was very cold, and the humidity upset me. My body began to distort, and all of me was a mixture of cold, rain, and despondency. Images of undulating streets lined with buildings appeared. I was traveling through the undulations. My discomfort began to become intolerable. Suddenly the image of my favorite armchair appeared in my consciousness. I was at home, reading and feeling protected and warm. The cold had disappeared and I felt very well. At that moment, the shaman began to chant a prayer. Saint Peter, Saint Paul. She repeated the names of the apostles along with phrases in Mazatec. Immediately, my hard-earned comfort, the warmth of my home and my whole self returned to the cold, the humidity and the desperation of a distorted body. Lying in that highland hut, it took me an eternity to recover. I saw the undulating streets again, and when I returned to my armchair, Maria sang again, Saint Peter, Saint Paul, making me return to bodily despair. This was repeated 7 times. Each time I was able to return to comfort and pleasure. The shaman would sing, bringing me out of my state and into the despair of the present. It was obvious that the Sabina recognized my mind and knew its changes. So synchronistic was her chanting with my psychic states that I soon thought her intention was malevolent, and in desperation, I sat up and went out into the open. I was greeted by a persistent rain, but I preferred it to the Sabinian hell inside the hut. Dawn broke, and I thanked God for the return of the light and for the miracle of the new day. It took me several years to understand and appreciate my experience. Maria Sabina had shown me one of my emotional refuges, my inability to live in the present, and my tendency to run away from reality to shelter in a structure of comfort. I thank her for the terrible teaching. Thank you, Maria Sabina, and keep creating wherever you are. Chapter 4. Don Ivan Ramón of Mexico City. Born in a small town in the Sierra of Oaxaca, relative of Doña Maria Sabina and descendant of a family of shamans, Ivan Ramón is a talented native Mexican psychologist. At the age of 5, Ivan began to show signs of an extraordinary and strange sensitivity. Suddenly, his personality would change along with his voice, and his behavior would transform. Believing him to be crazy, his mother had no idea that these were the first signs of a portentous mediumnity, and instead of encouraging him, she punished him. Repressed, this native psychologist did not dare to open up again until he was 15 years old, when he spontaneously went into a trance and communicated his clairvoyances. Today, Ivan Ramón works in Mexico City providing consultations to dozens of patients who come to visit him seeking healing for their ailments and illnesses. When a patient comes to his autochthonous office, Ivan feels the person's characteristic vibration in his fingertips. Once detected, he places his fingers on a ribbon and waits attentively for a sign. This native psychologist affirms that he is able to identify the specific and individual energy of each patient, and that by placing his fingers on the ribbon, he sends an unmistakable energetic code to higher intelligences that receive and decode it. Depending on this last operation, they respond with a diagnosis. If they do not respond, it means that the patient will die and cannot be cured. Ivan Ramón affirms that the percentage of correct predictions made with this method is very high. After receiving the answer to the energetic code, Ivan decides the treatment to use with each patient. With some he uses herbs and offal. The latter consist of a complicated maneuver in which, after rubbing the nape of the neck and forehead of the patient with a special liquid, Ivan taps and massages different parts of the patient's body. According to him, this treatment has the effect of achieving an energetic balance. Other treatments include steam baths, alternated with ice water rubs, and the introduction of the patient to a small box in which herbs are evaporated. Ivan Ramón claims to be able to cure diseases such as cancer, ulcers, epilepsy, viral infections, etc. One of the most interesting works that Ivan performs is exorcism. According to his vision of reality, there are beings in it that have died and that do not find the path to a healthy development. These beings are the ones who appropriate innocent minds and martyr them, believing them to be their property. When a patient comes to this native psychologist complaining of hearing strange voices commanding him to do absurd and harmful things, Ivan prepares a special ceremony by which he protects his patient and empowers him to reject the intruding entities. In this ceremony, Ivan goes into a trance, and a being of light and strength does the work of exorcism through his body. These supernatural beings are the ones who have taught this native psychologist everything he knows. I have attended several sessions in which I have been able to witness Ivan Ramón enter his trance. This includes a series of intense movements and breathing, similar to deep sighs, after which a total change in his personality occurs. I have observed at least 4 alternate personalities in Ivan: an old man, a Chinese man, a warrior, and a philosopher. During his manifestation, the room in which he works seems to be imbued with an electrifying atmosphere powerfully suggestive of the real existence of colossal beings. They deliver magnificent speeches and perform the work of cleaning or stripping. The healing processes and all the phenomena that exist are, according to Ivan Ramón, regulated by the interaction of 2 powers. On the one hand, a feminine power, nature and the earth; on the other, a masculine power, the Father or God. The Father guides and the Mother manifests. God decides and the earth executes. Both nature and God use intermediaries to realize phenomena. God uses realized beings, those who communicate with prepared men, such as shamans and saints. Nature uses elementals in number of 4: fire, earth, air, and water. Ivan Ramón derives his power from the use of the elementals and the fulfillment of the mandate of the beings of light. In this way, he acts as an instrument of healing. In this conception of reality, the balance between all forces is a fundamental factor of development and health. When there is balance, there is health. Disease is the product of an imbalance. For this native psychologist, one of the most unbalancing factors today are the chemicals that man uses in his diet and in his allopathic medicine. Against this, Ivan Ramón uses natural medicines in which there are the elemental forces of nature. Fire and water limpias abound in his treatments. Mental illness is, according to this shaman, a product of the interference that beings of low development have with the brain and the human mind. These interferences are provoked by witchcraft works in which a low astral is ordered to interact with a normal brain to affect its neural circuits and trigger unbalancing energetic explosions. Low astral beings are beings that may or may not have bodies. Ivan Ramón attending to one of his patients, his own, those who before their current condition were men who could not develop or who caused great damage. These beings are slaves of the sorcerers, who use them for their damages. Within Ivan Raymond's concepts of reality, reincarnation, the law of cause and effect, and the existence of different levels of reality and consciousness are commonplace. Ivan claims to know his own past lives, and to know, in addition, those of his patients. He claims to have lived in Aztec times, as a servant of one of the temples, that of the god Huitzilopochtli. Of this god, Ivan Ramón claims that he was a devourer of astral hearts, not to do evil, but to stimulate their development. As part of his contact with the origin of the Mexican, Ivan Ramón claims to be receiving messages from the ethereal inhabitants of the Aztec pantheon, who inform him about the possibility of one or more of our volcanoes, he calls them luminaries, erupting. This native psychologist says that in Guanajuato there is a lagoon called Iridia, which contains signs of future events. Depending on the color of the water and its level, it is possible to know what will happen. The concept of superhuman beings, alive and independent, with whom a shaman can come into contact, is one of the most common beliefs among men of knowledge. Doña Pachita, Don Florencio, Don Lucio, and Ivan Ramón himself hold it as an indubitable fact. Obviously, the verification of such a fact is, as yet, beyond the reach of our science, which cannot validate, although neither can it deny, such a possibility. It is enough to remember that we still do not know the origin of our capacity of consciousness and experience to understand the above. In general, contemporary psychiatry is becoming interested in some of the activities of shamans. For example, their use of medicinal herbs. There are, however, two currents within psychiatry. One that maintains that curanderismo in general and shamanism in particular are totally unrelated and cannot be contemplated within scientific practice. The other current considers that there is a millenary wisdom in the shaman that should be taken advantage of and known. A serious study of patients cured by shamans, as compared to those cured by psychiatrists, would illustrate the state of reality in both practices. I believe that such an investigation could bring us many surprises. Chapter 5. Doña Asunción de Hidalgo. In 1975, her eldest son died. While she was at the wake and unable to hold back her tears, suddenly her mouth closed and she lost consciousness. Those who were with her only saw that her body took on a different posture, and that her voice changed. She was no longer a woman, but a man full of guilt. She took them into an adjoining room, and there she asked their forgiveness. Through that grieving mother spoke someone who was neither her nor her dead son, but his murderer. She asked for forgiveness and mercy, promised to help and to sacrifice herself to pay for her guilt. From that day on, Doña Asunción knew that something strange had been born in her. She would sit in a chair, feel her mouth close and her body go, and then she would remember nothing. Her family and those who could see her told her that her dead son spoke through her mouth, and that she cured those she saw with ailments. I met her in a Saturday session in Ivan Raymond's meditation room. The session was memorable because, after 3 alternate personalities, Ivan became a Chinese doctor. He spoke and behaved like a real Oriental. Next to him sat Asunción, with her eyes closed. Suddenly, this woman began to manifest the respiratory rhythm alterations characteristic of entering a mediumistic trance. Then she got up from her seat and went over to Ivan Raymond's body. She spoke to him with a lexicon and intonation very similar to those of the Chinese, and he answered her. It was an inconceivable spectacle. A Mixtec and a woman from Hidalgo speaking Chinese and understanding each other perfectly. It was clear that they understood each other. In fact, they were arguing about something important judging by their gestures. Both of them, keeping up their dialogue, got ready to work with the people who, astonished, were watching the spectacle. They called us one by one, and in that strange language they questioned us, and then they gave us a massage. But this was not a normal massage. The procedure they used was almost identical for both of them, and consisted of placing their hands on the nape of the neck and forehead of each of us. Then they vibrated their hands rapidly. Further on, they would run their hands around our backs, vibrating them. Finally, they blew on the right and left side of our heads and threw water on us after doing the same to themselves. I took Doña Asunción to a subway station in the capital. I observed her features, Indian, strong, with 2 white braids framing her round face, full of wrinkles, maturity, and understanding. I asked him, "Why did it all start when your son died?" He replied that it was normal. When someone in a family had that gift, when they died, they passed it on to another member of the same family. I remembered Pachita and nodded. When she died, she had left Enrique, her youngest son, as heir to her native surgical faculties. What was inherited and what did this faculty of having alternate personalities mean? Doña Asunción's companions assured me that she could heal wounds and heal diabetics during their trances. However, Doña Asunción claimed that she could not remember anything that happened during her trances. She is, like Pachita, an unconscious medium. I wondered again what that means. Why do these people lose their daily consciousness and in that state perform their healings? How can we penetrate these mysteries and find out what they really mean? There are certainly many different levels of consciousness, each with its own phenomenology, but with common laws. During deep meditation, one can feel the presence of an inner center full of wisdom. Are these indigenous psychologists able to place themselves in that central region of the self, but out of a sense of humility, they consider it as totally alien to their own individuality, and therefore call it a protective spirit? The most profound explanation I know about the different states and levels of consciousness is the one that a Mexican shaman Nahual, Don Juan Matus, has offered. Don Juan's theories are widely described in Carlos Castaneda's books. According to him, every human being possesses a mechanism that aligns 2 bands of conscious emanations. On the one hand, emanations associated with the body, the internal ones, and on the other hand, external emanations coming from the very origin of the consciousness. According to Don Juan, there are a multitude of possible bands of alignment, and a mechanism that places the personal consciousness in contact with one of them, the point of attachment. The snap point acts as a luminous magnet that attracts certain internal bands and connects them with the external ones. Each time this happens, the human being enters a particular state of consciousness. Generally, we all have the lace point in a fixed position. When it moves, we enter into altered states of consciousness. The ordinary man is not able to manage his socket point at will and place it in the position that is most convenient or interesting to him. Only the man of knowledge has control over the positions of his lace point and can modify them at will. Perhaps our indigenous psychologists, with the faculty of unconscious mediumship, are somewhere in between the fully enlightened man of knowledge and the everyday man. The alternate personalities manifesting in them could be the manifestations of a peculiar approach to their point of encasement and a non-daily alignment of the bands of emanations. Obviously, explanations such as the above raise new questions and leave others unanswered. However, within all the possibilities of explanation, this one seems to me magnificent in its power. The experience of seeing Don Ivan Ramón and Doña Asunción penetrate a similar alternate personality could mean that in both of them, the lace point was placed in a similar or identical position, and that therefore both became 2 manifestations of the same personality. In other words, that both penetrated into the same level of consciousness, and that on this level the laws of operation and the contents are given and available to whoever is able to align the specific bands of emanations associated with it. If the above is correct, then what happened between Ivan and Asunción is that one of the 2, probably Ivan, moved the other one's point of encapsulation to the same position, and that is the reason for the similarity of their behaviors. In the lab, we are conducting research on the changes in brain activity of pairs during preverbal communication. We have found that the activity of the brains involved becomes very similar when both succeed in establishing empathic communication. In other words, When two human beings feel very close to each other and achieve a sense of intimacy of presence, their brain activity becomes contagious, and their electroencephalographic patterns become virtually identical. Something in Iván Ramón pushed Asunción's lace point to a position similar to his, and then both brains acquired similar patterns and similar behavioral manifestations. Chapter 6. Compiled by Eduardo Almeida Acosta. Eduardo Almeida Acosta, compiler of this chapter, is a professor at the School of Psychology of the UNAM. He is currently conducting studies on indigenous communities in the Puebla area. The transcriptions presented below are part of these studies. Presentation. Don Inocencio Flores de la Cruz was born in San Miguel, Sinacapan, municipality of Quetzalan, Puebla. He spent his first 12 years in his hometown. Then he lived 10 years as a farm laborer in San Juan Tenexiapa and 10 years as a stranger. He worked in different places. Finally, he returned to his hometown where he lived the last 24 years of his life. He died on August 18, 1983. The narrators of the following text are his son Don Lucio Flores Flores and his daughter-in-law, Doña Consuelo Contreras Tirado. The power of Don Inocencio. Don Inocencio got his power from a grandmother, Chepa de la Cruz, when he was a little boy. He was very attached to that lady, his grandmother, and because his abuelita was mean, she didn't want to teach him. But as the grandmother asked loudly in her prayers, what she heard was recorded, and so he learned. She was about 10 years old when he followed her on the sly. Behind her he was listening to her, good things and bad things. But he recorded only the good things, not the bad. He was good, although here he was being told that he was this and he was that he was not a healer, and he proved to them that he was. My dad learned from his aunt, but he did not have a group. He was on his own. He learned from one person, and maybe a gift that God gave him to learn. And when he saw that it worked, he took courage on his own with God. Aunt Chepa learned from her grandparents and great-grandparents. Aunt Chepa was a healer, and he followed her. She did not want to be followed. When Aunt Chepa did a good thing, she would let him regret it so he would hear. When she was going to do bad things, she wouldn't let him. She also worked in sorcery. My dad didn't work that. Maybe he knew. He said, I do straight work. If someone asked him, I want something to happen to that one, he would say, not me, find someone else. I give you so much. Even if you give me the kingdom. Don Ernesto, my father's brother, was spoiled by Aunt Chepa. He learned more. He does not make himself known. They come to see him from Chacoyolo, Ataxpe, Quetzaltecos. They come to see him for cures, for advice. My father worked in San Jose Acatino and San Juan Tenexiapa. He worked there. He helped them in the tobacco fields, planting chili and sesame. He was paid his daily wage, 25 cents a day. As an orphan, he had been taken by his uncle. At home, he was just being quartered. His father had shot him. He didn't hit him. He ran away. He was spoiled. Aunt, in this case grandmother aunt, in the Tabacol they punished him. He fooled them that he was an orphan. His uncle took him. When he saw that he was not being paid, a lady told him, you have no clothes. You don't earn here. If you want to earn even your underwear, go where they pay you. Not just where they give you tortillas because you're going to get stripped. Go clean bean plants. How much are you going to pay me? Minus 25 cents. We'll see if you can work. And so they kept increasing it. They paid for his clothes. They deducted it from his pay. Then a man came by. How much do they pay you? You are just going to take care of the cows. I'll pay you 75 cents, and I'll buy your clothes. I'll support you. He thought he was already earning a lot of money. That's where he stayed for a few years. He trusted the people who treated him well. He spent about 10 years as a stranger with only one employer. Then he moved from place to place. He could manage on his own. He taught himself so whether he goes out or not. When he was little, he left home at the age of 12 with an uncle, Miguel de la Cruz. That's where he worked. He did years. About 20 years. He started practicing during an epidemic, when one of his compadres asked him to do it in San Juan Tenexiapa. There he made his first healing. Then the compadre said to his wife, I'm going to take the sun. because they took them to the doctor to die. He cured some of them. He said, "I am going to dilate." He would be ready for tomorrow. A healer appeared. People were piling up on him, and the doctor got upset. He gave bills to a gentleman to whom he asked the favor to hurt him. But this man took the bills and shared them with the healer. "You are good," he said. "The one who deserves to be hurt is the doctor. When there was that epidemic, he cured. He didn't give them any medicine. He took the little water. They wanted to kill him out of envy. He who cures without medicine knows how to cure. When he was young, he dedicated himself to his work in the fields, in the day laborers. When, with little sight, he began to get fully involved in these matters. When one is strong, the field. When you are not, you look for a trade. He cured, but it was not published that he did that. He said, 'Don't let it be published that I cure.' Sometimes he was invited to healers' meetings. 'They invite me to something important,' he would say. But he didn't want to go. He didn't like it. Like Jesus, who said, 'Let it not be known.' He said, 'Then come the cocolazos later.' How he healed, he had something like a clairvoyance. There was the blow. He said that some souls spoke to him and brought him the news. They came to tell him if he was going to cure a sick person. Today, they don't give him an answer. He would say to those he cured, 'Come until Saturday.' And then he would give them the answer. The news would come to him as to why they were suffering from that illness. He would say that the Lord, through his Spirit, was speaking to him personally, that they were the dead, souls that brought him the news. We here are worldly, but there are good souls who come to help, who tell us what to do. Everything came to him as news in his dreams. That you will get paid for this, that you will not get paid for this. Charitable people would give him a penny because they saw the work he was doing, that what he said was true. They would say, 'I have already seen several doctors. And you, what do you see in me?' He said, 'Bring me a candle.' If it was Monday, he would say, 'Come on Wednesday and we'll talk.' You didn't get sick just because you got sick. God sent you the disease. That's how you start talking. But we don't think we are hurting a neighbor or hurting the ranch. And even if we don't want it to be known, it is known. Well, nobody tells me. That's why I was telling them to come, so I could tell them what they have. He told us what he dreamed. He told them that they were clairvoyances. He could tell by dreaming. He had no time to cure, but he had days, any day except Friday or Tuesday. Don Inocencio fasted so that what he asked for would be attended to. He fasted for a whole day. One of the things that I also admire is that he knew when to touch his head. He would give contacts. Where the patient felt the pain, he also attacked my father's pain. I admire him, and he used to tell them so much, 'It hurts you here, it hurts you here.' And if it was a matter of curing it, he would take care of it on his own. Other times, to cure, Don Inocencio would take a glass of water, elderberry and an egg. He used the elderberry for all bad things. He would sweep the person with the elderberry and the egg. Then he would break the egg in the glass of water, and place the elderberry in a cross on top of the glass, so that what he gathered from the evil would not escape. Then he would observe the drool that remained in the glass, as if they were candles. And then he would tell the patient, the one he was healing, what he saw, that they were doing him wrong. There you can see it. He used tea leaf to take out the evil that is in the stomach. When one is listless, with diarrhea, with lack of appetite, that's how you end up. He cured in his room. Only there he worked. He had his Christ and a medal in a little box, and he always carried it. It was his strongest weapon here in the world. He had the altar with his candles. The person who went to see him always carried a candle, just one candle. He would light it and place it on the altar. The altar had an image of the Santo Niño, a familiar San Antonio, and other images, but his altar never lacked flowers. He had to decorate it. To whoever came to consult him, he would say, "You bring me a candle." Candle and copal. Incense to ward off temptations, like the priest. He always had his candle lit. I was praying for him. If not, imagine he would go without food. When a candle is lit and goes out by itself, it means that the sick person has no more life. The disease has already gone too far down the road. If God does it, he considered his job as a charitable one. I do not know how to explain this. When they needed him, people would come to solicit his favor. Even if he didn't want to, he would attend. I can't refuse, that's true. I don't do that job, but I can do it. If they believe it's going to be the job. If not, there is no relief. I will do the work but not the healing. I lay hands on the person, and sometimes I really saw him healing. Once HG's wife came with her 8-day-old baby. She had already been to the doctor. He could not urinate. He was just crying. He was clogged. And they already went to see the doctor, he said and laughed. He took the brandy, wet the palm of his hand and put his hand on the child's crown. And he said to him, "Now you are not baptized. Now I will baptize you with the aguardiente, but don't become a drunkard." He began to move his bladder. "Didn't he urinate?" he said. "I was shaking him just a little, just a little. Now he's going to unclog his pants." At that moment he poured the water on him. You won't believe it. And now he's had both of them. The father stood up. "Oh, compadrito, how much I congratulate you. You saved my son." Then he said to him, "Here is the medicine. That's why I told them, if you have faith in God, without faith, how can I do the healing if God does it, not me?" On the third day he was uncovered. They brought him back and he was fine. Once a lady came with a boy, a big boy, about 15 years old. She told the lady to cure him. At that moment they came and asked her to cure him. He said, "I haven't asked God yet," but he gave him compassion, put his hand on his head. He sat down, perhaps praying with God. He healed him just like that out of the blue. At about 12 noon, I went to leave the tortillas for my husband. He was just nodding off. "My head hurts," and he was complaining. "So why did you do that job?" I felt sorry for the boy. "But they've done a bad thing." I get the news. Some bad things. The boy is bad because he took some pennies and some totals from a lady. They went to sell them. They kept that money. The lady looked for a way to find out. She looked for sorcerers, and the boy's hand shrunk. The mother arrived with a headache and the boy with a shrunken hand. I spoke to my husband and told him, "His dad is in very bad shape." I left him nodding. He is complaining. At about 3 o'clock my husband arrived. His dad was complaining to help him that he was being thrown in the hole. "You better take me home. They are killing me." He said, "I'm going to die for sticking my hand in without God's permission." What the boy was feeling stayed with him. He was going to die. My husband grabbed a cup and poured 2 Alka-Seltzers in it. He took an elderberry roll and a soft-boiled egg. "That'll do," he said. And whatever he asked for, my husband was doing. He was rubbing it. He was praying to it. He was dictating how to do it. A little bit of ground salt. A pot. Pour the aguardiente there. Prepare with aguardiente, and with that, sobame the whole body. Drink me, but don't be afraid. My husband thought, as it happened to him, the evil will happen to me. But he said, "I am not afraid of you, if you are my father." Then after about 3 hours he stopped. He wanted to eat. But he could not eat. His jaw stiffened. At about 10 o'clock at night he called us where he was sleeping. "How did you feel that you were just having visions? You told us that you were not in your bed, that you were seeing creatures." As he had not asked for permission, that boy was feeling bad. I was saved thanks to my son. He had not entrusted himself to God, and that is why the boy's illness was passed on to him. He knew the past and the future. His clairvoyance brought him, or he saw what could happen. He could tell. He would tell them, "First you must repent to God and then you come." He would come back, "I already asked God for forgiveness. Without that, you don't have a ticket," as they say. And I was already telling them what they had done. "No, that's not true," they said, "but who knows how he knew that you are thinking this, that you are talking this. They just take your word for it and go around cursing. You go around begging, but they don't want you." I told him, "This is what my brothers tell me." And he would answer me, "You go around messing with your brothers, and you see that they don't like you." Then he would say, "Now one is going to come from far away," and that person had to come. They even came from Mexico, and one from Puebla also came, who had a headache all his life. He said, "Unbelievable, I am a nobody. You have money. Why don't you go see a doctor?" The patient said, "I have faith in God and in you. It happens if you have faith in God." He grabbed the aguardiente, shook their hands, and told them what was wrong with their stomachs. "How does it taste?" they asked. Even if they are not talking to him, he already told them what they have done. They would sit and ask him, "How are you doing? You don't realize it, but I am talking to the spirit." The person said, "Yes, I do." He would say, "You did this and you can't deny me." He could not be fooled. "You're telling me yourself as if you were talking to me." The treasure of protection, he had an object like a treasure, let's say. Then the treasure, he would take it to a place in a house. If someone said, "I want there to be life in my house," he would take it and apply it in his house. And he would commit, and nothing should happen in that house in that year, no diseases, nothing. The treasure was, for example, like an heirloom. He would get wax from the beehives, tobacco, copal. I got the blessed palm of Ramos and the wax. And he would bring some money coins. He would put it all together like a ball. He would dig it up and put it in a little hole, and it would stay there all year long. He would ask for a novena, and the day the novena was over he would go to decorate the house of those who asked him for that favor. Every year he would change the treasure. Things lose their aroma and strength. I would ask him, he did not want to say. That treasure that they take to the houses, there is never anything missing. There are all kinds of seeds. They called it tajpalo. Ne niktalati se tajpalo. I offer an offering in the name of so-and-so or Satano so that nothing happens. And he named the people who are. Here the people were happy. With the faith of those people and the faith of my father, they made him a little meal. They took good care of him. Sometimes I accompanied him. Husero, Don Inocencio was a bonesmith too. He learned it from his father. His dad had fallen off a beast. He couldn't get up. "I'm going to die." She grabbed his left hand and stopped him. "I'm going to break my heart because my hand hurts so much." Don Inocencio began to fix his father's hand. In the afternoon he asked him, "Does it hurt anymore?" "Not anymore, just a little." She heated salt water and began to rub him, to splash him, and tied his hand. His father said to him, "And how did you plan to fix my hand, God and luck? How did you think? It had already broken down." And that's how he started. He was still small. He was a good bone man. There was a man who wanted to see his ear. "My hand is as if it were just undercut," he said. He came and told him, "Come, bring your hand." The bone was broken. "Your bone is broken." The bone setter said to him, "It is only stressed." And it was broken. The gentleman went to Tezudalan and there they took x-rays. He was broken. He came admiringly. "They told me it was broken. That's why I can't get it fixed." "Ah, you didn't believe me." "Yes, I didn't believe you. The bone menders said it was stressed, and you said it was broken. Then you believed me as a creature, which was not true. But now I do. I thank you so much. I get pangs. Even now I believe in you. Don't believe in me. Believe in God. He's the one who does it." And the man came to give her 500 pesos of those days. "You got me out of my doubt." The bone was well crushed. He said to him, "Hear how it does. It grinds the wrist bones. I thank you so much. Now they are going to operate on my hand." Those who received the power of Don Inocencio when Don Inocencio was running out of energy, I would ask him to make a little paper. He would say, "They are also blessed by God." They went to the doctrine. He was teaching some people. A girl he had on his side, RAG, from Ayotzinapa, and her aunt, RG, from Sinacapan, who was married to PM, he met them like this. A woman from Ayotzinapa had been in the hospital for 8 days. Her blood flow would not stop. Her mother-in-law told her to come to see Don Inocencio. The lady's son-in-law came one morning at about 6 o'clock. He said, "Let's see if you can get me out of this doubt. My wife is dying." "What's wrong with her?" "She has blood flow. If you have faith in me, I will prepare the medicine. Buy 2 chocolates, a cinnamon stick, and a bunch of rue. Take 3 sprigs to put with the rest in the boiling water." Then they prepared and gave him to drink. The next day, the gentleman came to see him and told him that the lady was better, that her discharge had stopped. Then Don Inocencio told her that in the afternoon she should only drink half a cup and not lift heavy things. On the 3rd day the lady came back. They came to thank him for the favor he had done them and asked him how much it was. He told them it was nothing, that he just wanted her to get relief, and that was all. Afterwards, Don Inocencio told the lady that if her daughter wanted to know how to learn, he could teach her. And after he told her parents that he was going to teach her, his sister-in-law came bringing her mother, who was also sick. "Is it true that you are going to teach my niece?" Don Inocencio said, "Well, I was telling him that if your sister's daughter wants to learn, I can teach her." "I'd like to learn too," said the aunt. "If you are going to teach her, why don't you teach me too?" my father-in-law said. "I would like to have someone left to cure, but not one of my children." When a son asked him to learn, Don Inocencio said, "It is a commitment to do those jobs they ask one to do." The son asked him, and he didn't want to. Later, when I can no longer do it, when he began to teach the aunt and the niece, he was already thinking about leaving us. He went to Chilcoita. That house was his, only his, and then the girls left, the aunt and the niece, to learn. They were going to stay there. I saw the girls' notebook. They were writing. I was tempted to take it, but God told me, "Leave it now." When she left for Chilcoita, she took her altar and everything. Once I went to Chilcoita and saw that the aunt and niece had written some prayers in a notebook. Don Inocencio showed them to her. A prayer from the diary, a prayer to defend themselves, prayer to ask for the frightened, prayer if the Holy Land embraces them, prayer if the fire scorches them, prayer if they fall in water. Don Inocencio told me, "Don't be touching those things because the girl is going to get angry. The power is prayer and the strength is with God." Don Inocencio did not want me to learn the prayers. Sometimes I would ask him how to say them so that nothing would be missing. "I am here," he would say. "I have the offering so that there will be no lack of food." When his children got sick, he obliged himself to cure them. "When they need me," he would say, "they will remember me." Chapter 7. Doña Licha de Puebla. A colleague, Gretchen, and I went to Puebla to look for Doña Licha, a native psychologist who lives in that state. We did not know Doña Licha's address, and in order to find her, we decided to ask people who seemed to be natives of the place, and likely acquaintances of hers. We were mistaken several times, until it occurred to us to question a cab driver, who immediately gave us directions to her house. Her home was part of a group of interconnected rooms surrounding a courtyard with gardens. From the entrance you could feel an atmosphere of cleanliness, neatness, and strength. A very beautiful young woman asked me the reason for our visit, and in doing so, I felt how her gaze penetrated me in her attempt to listen to my intentions. I told her that we were coming to see Doña Licha, and after asking her, she let us pass. Doña Licha appeared. She seemed jovial, kind, and mature. I told her that we were apprentices, and that we were conducting a study about the men and women of knowledge in Mexico, and that we had chosen her because of references from one of Don Ivan Raymond's disciples in Mexico City. I was surprised by the atmosphere in her house. We were in a room painted green and white, with an altar and a lit candle. Everything was in its place, clean, tidy, with a radio recorder playing music while Doña Licha talked to us about her life and work. She told us that at the age of 10 she was bitten by a scorpion, and as a result of its venom, she lost consciousness, and her belly began to swell. A doctor was brought in, but he, unable to find or hear a pulse, diagnosed her as dead and did not inject her with any antidote. Several hours passed, during which the family began to prepare for the wake. Her mother, inconsolable, hugged her crying, and when this was repeated several times, the girl opened her eyes, hugged her mother, and told her not to worry, that she was fine. A few days later, Licha went to the countryside with her grandmother. The latter was riding a donkey while the little girl followed her on foot. Suddenly, Licha heard a sound like the flapping of a turkey's wings, followed by heavy breathing. She asked her grandmother, and noticed that the donkey moved its ears as if anticipating some danger. Grandma hadn't heard anything, but she settled back in her chair, and Licha bravely pulled the donkey home. Then Licha began to feel very ill. Her hands were twisted and her emotions were easily upset. She was taken to a healer, who told her that she had been in a death trance and had acquired the power of healing, and that she should use it. Doña Licha followed her advice, and from that moment on, her bodily and emotional problems were completely solved. Doña Licha realized that she could remove ailments, cure illnesses, and solve the problems of patients who came to consult her in increasing numbers. Depending on what they had, Doña Licha gave them individualized treatment. Some received cleansings with eggs and herbs. Others were treated by placing her hands on different parts of their bodies. For still others, Licha would take a view that allowed her to diagnose and plan their treatment. These techniques will be described below. Doña Licha's healing techniques. Visions are a common diagnostic procedure among the shamans and healers of Mexico. They consist of rubbing fresh eggs all over the patient's body, starting with the head and ending with the feet. The eggs are then poured into glasses containing clean water. Depending on the shapes that both the white and the yolk acquire, the shaman interprets the patient's ailment and offers a diagnosis. In general, the white signifies the spiritual part of the patient, and its forms indicate to the shaman the energies surrounding his body, how they influence and control him. The yolk, on the other hand, represents the physical body. In it, excrescences signify diseased areas of the body, flows signify infections, and other darks model aspects of great negativity. Bubbles in the clear are interpreted as beings associated with the patient's energy field. Depending on their position, the diagnosis varies, especially if protein veils are associated with them. When the yolk is covered by one of these veils, and there are also bubbles on the surface, the diagnosis is negative. If the yolk is clear or an isolated bubble is found floating within the white, it is interpreted as positive, signifying the presence of a guide or protector of the patient. When two large bubbles surrounded by a veil are observed floating above the yolk, the diagnosis is of a being who is watching the patient and has been placed there by an enemy as a result of envy or jealousy. When the bubble is found embedded in the yolk, it is considered that there is a drowned spirit. Actually, the description I have just given gives but a slight idea of the complexity of the diagnosis associated with the form of views. Depending on the diagnosis of the eyesight, Doña Licha decides on its treatment. This may consist of a cleansing using as an instrument the native psychologist's own body and her hands, as a means to the use of eggs that are rubbed on the head, back, hands and arms of the patient, or lotions that are smeared on the temples in order to clear negative energies. Doña Licha uses a peculiar procedure that consists of placing her hands, previously bathed in balsam, over the patient's ears, making an outward suction-like movement. Later on, she rubs the nape of the neck and the forehead of the patient, and finally blows strongly, directing the air towards the nape of the neck. I underwent a procedure like the one I have just described with very positive results. My sensation: relaxation and release of mental blockages. Doña Licha says that all the procedures she uses come to her by an act of intuition. Through this same act, Doña Licha claims to be able to distinguish whether people who come to visit her are sick or possess a psychic power that they have not developed. According to her, if a person has the gift of healing but does not use it, the energy she does not give accumulates in her body and causes disorders. As I mentioned before, Doña Licha recalls that realizing this in her own process has allowed her to understand that of her patients. "The more I heal and give," she told me in a cheerful voice, "the better I feel. Every time I heal a patient, I heal myself." Doña Licha uses her own body as a tool in her healing. She distinguishes illness through her hands, placing them on different areas of her patients' bodies, thus detecting excess or lack of energy, imbalances, or balances. This indigenous psychologist claims to be able to differentiate between a patient's illness and the gift of power or healing, which may manifest similar symptoms. When she discovers a power in someone, she does what she can to encourage its development. In both cases, illness or power, Doña Licha tries not to create dependencies. One of the most impressive lessons Doña Licha offers is the trust in her body as an instrument of healing. Herbs, cleansing eggs, and medicines are seen as incidental and secondary to her natural presence and intuition. When asked about the origin of her healing ability, she insists that it depends on her degree of surrender and impeccability. Doña Licha is not a medium, nor does she seem interested in penetrating unconscious trances. What she does express is a fervent desire to find a master to guide her on her path. When I mentioned to her the existence of Don Lucio, who like her had a death trance, but unlike hers, not for a few hours but for 3 full years, Doña Licha expressed curiosity and hope that someone like that could guide her. Contrary to Don Lucio, Doña Licha does not remember what happened in her death trance. She only recognizes that it was after it that she acquired gifts of healing. Don Lucio claims that during his 3-year trance, he was instructed by the time workers, who guided him and taught him how to heal. It is very interesting that these two characters developed their healing ability after such a similar event, although of different duration. Chapter 8. The Hasidim of Morelos. 5 years ago I had the great privilege of meeting a group of Mexican farmers interested in the development of consciousness. They live in the state of Morelos, in a small picturesque town 50 kilometers from Mexico City. When I met them, they invited me to learn about their development work, and I was amazed by their motivation, humility, innocence, and sensitivity. Twice a week they met to learn healing techniques, energy management, and above all, what they called detachments. The latter term denotes the ability to effect a separation between body and psyche or between spirit and matter. Specialized guides among them are dedicated to teaching candidates of the same people how their spirits can disconnect from their bodies. They say that these detachments leave the body free to be occupied by other consciousnesses, capable of systematically developing their brains and bodies. The most advanced among the candidates become part of a body of specialists that they call faculties. The faculties heal, give advice, and communicate with superhuman beings. This communication is, according to this group of peasants, essential to receive teachings about the self and consciousness. They do not call it that, but their work is that of a true institute of psychic research about consciousness. I call them the Hasidim of Morelos because they remind me of a movement of Jewish mystics that arose in Poland around the middle of the 15th century, led by Israel Baal Shem Tov. Jewish Hasidism was also made up of humble, innocent people of great sensitivity who, like the peasants of Morelos, were interested in developing their capacity to be in contact with God through their spiritually motivated hearts. The Hasidim of Morelos offer a spectacle of true devotion and love for anyone lucky enough to meet them. Every Sunday morning, they gather in a prayer room and listen to the most advanced among their body of empowered people. This one, whom they call a guardian, goes into a mediumistic trance and dictates a lecture for the congregation. In these lectures, the guardian speaks of the divine essence as the inheritance of all men and explains that in each of us is found the light of God. In addition to their work of learning and Sunday lectures, the Hasidim of Morelos dedicate 2 days a week to heal any sick person who requests it. The development work and the acquired teachings acquire in the healing work of the community a true social function. According to the conception of reality of these autochthonous psychologists, the human being is in communication with ethereal beings that belong to another existential reality. These spiritual beings have varying degrees of development. The more advanced ones are capable of teaching the human being, if the latter is able to establish communication with them. The less advanced ones are in search of light that a developed faculty can offer them. In this way, there is a continuous exchange between spiritual beings and men. Each spiritual being, according to the Morelos Hasidim, has his own individuality, as do human beings. However, we all share the same essence, the altar of the temple of the Hasidim. The more advanced ones manage to establish a closer and more fluid contact with their essence. The less advanced are far from that contact. The true path of development consists in opening oneself to achieve an intimate contact with the essence. This is precisely what the most advanced faculty achieves during the Sunday lectures. The lineage of the Hasidim of Morelos comes from a group of Mexicans that was formed in Xochimilco during the last century. The Xochimilco group announced that humanity had entered a new stage of its development, which they called Third Time. Mexico was considered the seat of this change of consciousness, and soon groups similar to the one in Xochimilco began to form throughout the country. Currently, localities such as Yautepec, Puebla, Cuernavaca, Mexico City, and many others have groups similar to the Hasidim of Morelos, forming a true network of development that goes unnoticed by most Mexicans. This subway network constitutes, in my opinion, one of the most interesting lineages of autochthonous psychologists in Mexico. Chapter 9. Don Florencio de Morelos. Don Florencio is one of the members of the group of peasants living in Morelos who have dedicated themselves during the last few years to the development of a series of practices aimed at the expansion of consciousness. Currently, Don Florencio is the guardian of the group, and his function is to watch over their practices so that they do not lose vigor or deviate. In this chapter, I will attempt to describe the work that Don Florencio does and the group to which he belongs. Background: at the end of the last century, a new lineage of indigenous psychologists began in Xochimilco. This lineage was dedicated to developing among its most sensitive members a capacity to penetrate altered levels of consciousness and live an alternate reality level in which they received messages and achieved lucid cognitions about historical and personal events. Every Sunday, for more than half a century, this lineage gathered to receive what they called lectures, given by a veteran member who would enter into a trance and, in that state, receive a series of messages which, in turn, he would transmit to his listeners. This group of peasants belongs to a series of congregations working in Mexico City, Yautepec, Totolapan, and other towns in the state of Morelos, and who seem to be descendants of the first group mentioned above. Don Florencio's group is organized in a very similar way to the other groups. These organizations are commanded by a triumvirate, made up of a guardian, a guide, and a character named Pedro. The function of the guardian, as already mentioned, is to oversee the group's practices. The guide directs its development, and Pedro is in charge of maintaining its cohesion. In addition to this leading triumvirate, there are the so-called faculties, which act as receivers and transmitters of the messages. These faculties receive training that prepares them for their mediumistic work. The messages are transmitted by means of discourses called lectures, which are offered by these faculties in a trance state on Sundays. The groups are also formed by the so-called columns, in charge of watching that the messages of the faculties reach attentive ears. In a direct transcription of a conversation held with Don Florencio, he gives an account of the phenomenology of the entrance of a faculty into the trance state, in which he offers a professorship. This transcription is found at the end of this chapter, Don Florencio's concept of life. According to Don Florencio, there is no death of the self. Only those who have behaved negatively during their lives, those who have caused harm and pain, die definitively. On the other hand, the kind human beings who have done good live forever. According to Don Florencio, reincarnation exists, and the meaning of existence is the achievement of an ever greater contact with the essence. The essence, according to the lineage of Don Florencio, is presented to a faculty developed to give lectures. The essence is true when in successive lectures it shows changes, and it is false or materialized when in the lectures the same discourse is repeated. The latter is a sign that the faculty is poor in its development. The essence is internal and not external. That is, what a faculty learns during its development is to establish contact with itself. The development of a faculty is called detachment. A candidate to become a faculty learns to separate or detach itself from its body in order to be able to connect with the essence or with some spiritual being of intermediate category between conventional human beings and the essence. The tribes of spiritual beings. According to Don Florencio, each spiritual being has a different level of contact with the essence. A faculty that has contact with a spiritual being receives the level of contact with the essence. The brain of a faculty is called the apparatus and serves, according to this lineage of autochthonous psychologists, to establish a specific and selective contact with a certain spiritual being or with the essence. Don Florencio mentions names such as Benjamin of the Jungle, Blue Feather, Redbeak, etc., to identify the tribe of spiritual beings with whom the faculties of his temple have established contact. Don Florencio's apprenticeship. This indigenous psychologist confessed to me that his development has taken 10 years, and that his teachers have been faculties from different temples in Mexico City, Yautepec, and Totolapan. In his apprenticeship, Don Florencio has gone through different stages or levels. In the beginning, he believed that both spiritual beings and essence were external and independent of himself. At present, he believes that the essence is internal, and that it is found in all levels of organization of the human being, from his cells, tissues, and organs to his person as a whole. The chairs. Every Sunday, Don Florencio offers a lecture to the members of his community. In an enclosed area, the guide and the Pedro of the community gather, along with the faculties and the villagers, mostly women. 3 large candles are lit in front of the 7-step altar, and the community guide begins to speak. His words are framed by the flowers on the altar and a picture of an eye from which 7 rays emerge. The guide's speech invites to recollection, prayer, and meditation. He speaks about the arrival of the essence and prepares the guardian to enter into a trance so that he can, in that state, speak to the community. After several minutes, the guardian, Don Florencio, falls into a kind of stupor, accompanied by slight body movements. He closes his eyes and occupies the largest chair on the dais. When the guide finishes his speech, Don Florencio begins his own. The following is a verbatim transcription of a lecture given by Don Florencio on Sunday, December 8, 1985. The guide of the autochthonous psychologists, praying at the end of a lecture. Don Florencio's lecture: Peace on earth to men of good will, glory to God in the highest. On the scale of perfection born, and there he is among us. O beloved people, O blessed hearts who have gathered in this mystery of peace, and I come after you, representing the 7 seals, the 7 churches planted by the envoy of the 3rd day. Behold, blessed people, whom I have truly seen. In certain you are gathered together in this mystery prepared by my mantle. God, representing the 12 tribes incarnated and disincarnated on this planet Earth. I welcome you. Set down your plant in this plan where I am going to give you the lesson of peace that still corresponds to you in this instant. To those of you who have come to be close to me, welcome, people, from the moment you have prepared your plant at the porch of this lintel prepared. I welcome you, people. Hearts very called to which you can find yourself prepared in this blessed dawn, December 8, 1985, in which once again with my sublime word, with my sacrosanct voice, I come to deliver to you in the dawn of grace one more lesson in that moment in which you have heard from my sublime word a different lesson. And now I come to deliver it before you, blessed hearts who have gathered since that moment of awakening. The echo of that sonorous bell, to reach my beloved hearts, has passed many times before, and you have always enjoyed in this house of mine blessed adoration where you have known my spiritual doctrine. Where have you gone back to since a few years ago? Truly, you are still the same little infant whom you meet at every instant and moment to come and listen to my sublime word. From my sacred word, from my virtues and prodigies, I come to pour out to each one of you in this electronic device that melts your own wisdom. How uncertain, if in truth I tell you, people, you have listened to my word, but you have not valued what I come to teach you in soul. After so long a time, many years have passed, and few are those hearts that have truly struggled and prepared themselves without a plant. They have prepared their corporeal body to accept, once again, my teaching, my essence, which I come to deliver to you. That divine light comes from yourself, that church, that temple that you create yourself, blessed hearts, to which you must value dawn after dawn, and which you must appraise as a jewel that is on this earthly plane, and that you yourself are, beloved heart. You are the same that evolves through a device that makes you know and feel, beloved hearts. But you have never been able to do so. Here is my lesson prepared, which continues in itself for you. At that time you met a man named Abraham, who could have been a sincere and faithful friend of the perfect essence. How is that essence to be found? It could be in space on the earth plane where you dwell, people. In the wind, in the noise of 2 or more corners of the earth, and that essence that truly makes you feel about yourself to take you to very beautiful places. That essence makes you know your own understanding about others on earth. I come to pour that essence into yourself, and you are the same. The one who must feel with the very cell of your mind. That man at that moment, tired of years, of a century of years, thought that he was not alone on planet Earth. Days passed after a century, and that man with a dream could see, hear, and feel through his dream that he would have to have a son, the one who will spread in the land of Cana. But time passed, and that man's wife, fearing 90 years, could not conceive a son. But who, as the mind of man, she knew that at any moment, being the same perfect essence and the sublime wisdom of a powerful mind, the moment came when once again she could see a son conceived in the womb of that old woman and that old man of more than a century of years. Thinking of the perfect sublime essence and of the doctrine that he himself understood and introduced into his own mind, he was quite sure that what his dreams had brought forward to him was proved by an essence, by a wisdom. Then that man arrived at the moment and knew that now he did have a son, whom he would have to see flourish in the land of Cana. What would be the flowering of those foreign lands? The son that he had, and that could spread through many years in those lonely lands, those lands that had no one to work them in order to flourish the earthly plane. The years passed of that man, who began to become a man, then that friend of the perfect essence, whom you may call your God and Lord, who is Jehovah, though you do not know him, blessed people. The perfect essence which none of us can behold. Where can this essence be found? Not knowing what is the practice and wisdom that exists about yourself, the very essence and perfect light that pours into the cell of each of you. It was in the wise mind that drives each corporeal body of us on this plane. That man again had another dream, where his own wisdom was realizing through his dreams that he had to give a tribute, a holocaust to the perfect essence to prove that his wisdom was perfect and was in himself. That essence existed, though he felt the moment. He was testing in himself whether he trusted the wisdom of his own mind. That little one that he made present as a little man to sacrifice and offer as a sacrifice to his God and Lord, the very essence that melted into his wisdom, was tested. And who could that little man have been? The very bodies that gather in every precinct, in every house, in blessed worship, where the gatherings and congregations of the corporeal souls come and approach to meditate a few minutes in the blessed things of prayer, where they want to connect their minds with the great wisdom they desire, so that man on the earth plane may reach new horizons. Man will have to find great things in the future because the earth plane is covered with great material masses. In the nature of the earth, there are many things blessed and sacred in themselves. In the bowels of the earth, great things and minerals that you can behold, blessed hearts. In every place on earth, the places in the bowels of the earth are different. Why are they different? Because the same minerals do not exist in all places, as once again the great scientists of the earth, the most advanced men who go into the beyond, are finding. And you, blessed hearts, why can you not advance more in my divine cause, which is also yours, and which melts in you? That essence is close to you, through your wisdom, so that you may grasp sacred things, important things, so that man on earth may know. And you, why can you not do it, blessed hearts, if you are also man? Who can qualify strange things to his own brother and fellow man? They pass on, and verily that man has qualified that if it be true, the man of earth is mighty. It is the very essence and perfect light that is shed through an invisible God, through a God that exists within your own heart. Blessed people, do not think, beloved hearts, that the image is God, that the statue is God, that it forms everywhere the places of the whole universe. No, beloved people, that is a statue, images that melt like yourself, that you can find your image by means of a device that can melt. so that tomorrow will tell of the humanity that you fought and worked through time, and that you could know, healthy and perfect, clean as the saints. And this is one of my words that I come to teach you at dawn past. At that moment, the day of December, that you could see contemplated, where I could have given you, blessed hearts, great wonders that you can discover yourself in the future. And I could see you wondering how the man of the earth evolves through the times, through different stages. As indeed, at that time, I could see you wondering about the great reigns, as it is all coming to an end, and as indeed the life of Jesus the Christ of that time, that you have seen spoken through the biblical scientists, through the Roman doctrine, and you are becoming aware of a birth of Jesus called the Nazarene. Did Jesus come to be born to be a man who would come to attack the mankind of this world? No, blessed hearts, because in a way he came to affirm that time was king, because he asked you questions, summaries, and you did not know how to answer them. At last he died, shed his blood, and from there it was over to be a king of the earth plane. You are either right, people, or you are not right, because I can tell you, blessed hearts, now the essence of a king is upon yourself, blessed hearts, because you are the very king you found with your own agency. You can leap over the fence of a prison, where you can find yourself and recreate yourself everywhere, in all the places of the earth. Then who is the king, O people, blessed hearts? Is the God of whom you spoke at that time the king among yourself, come to ordain you as a great authority of this world? No, blessed hearts, no, people. Do not be deceived by those men who have indeed inculcated mankind for a short time. But all is passing away, and all will put your hearts at peace. Now, in your own wisdom, in your own knowledge, in your own understanding, there is for your knowledge a Holy Spirit which melts in your own mind. And you are yourself the king that can be in this world. For everything depends upon you, beloved heart. For I can tell you that in you is all that you can do in the world, so that you may withdraw into a way of great stoniness, so that your heart may be damaged by means of a thorn and a burr, and so that your heart may cleanse and heal. You are also delivered so that you yourself, in your God and Lord who is in you, in your own inner heart. This was one of my teachings today. And now I have delivered a line further on what you should have heard, people, on that day. Now I come to deliver to you one more lesson. What is it that I have delivered to you on this blessed dawn of grace, December 8th, 1985, to which, once again in proportion, I have delivered in small portion. I have received hearts, to those of you who have indeed trespassed before your brother and fellow man, to those of you who have indeed committed high errors in your own understanding. I forgive you. I forgive you. Why do I forgive you? Because I come to teach you blessed and holy things. And in yourself there is forgiveness. In yourself there is, through your understanding, you are forgiven yourself. Because you yourself are the one who will fight and work, so that the load that you carry at the foot of the slope is not so heavy to reach that new horizon by breaking a star, which comes illuminated to lead you to a more sacred place. To be at the right hand of the great intelligence and wisdom that you lead in your own wisdom, so that in this way there can be a new evolution, a new resurrection of your own spirit. He will be the future, and you will be the one who has truly been the man of the earth as a pendulum. This is one of my words that I come to deliver to you as wisdom and great and perfect essence from the high cosmos of a planet where you can find yourself, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What have you prepared, guide of multitudes? The guide speaks. We are filled with love, filled with confidence as we receive your teaching, Father, which is a school where we come to learn the first steps. We thank you, Lord, for imparting your presence to those present. Lord, infinite thanks. Answer the guardian. The thanks you give to the God who indeed comes to give you wisdom and teaching, and to the one who melts into yourself through the trust and faith that exists within your heart, the temple of your inner heart, that you are the very one who gives thanks to the God and Lord, to the one who infuses in your own knowledge and wisdom. Indeed, I was saying, thank you. I, beloved man, from this instant, to the crescent body, so that once again in them may be felt and poured, that it is the essence that comes to deliver to you, and that, for instance, you think you go to the struggle of your own evolution, and in this moment I have delivered people. I have delivered hearts, that you are listening to me in this instant, and to which you yourself can produce a great sacrifice towards the future, giving you the own interest to reach the wisdom of this planet Earth, to know of your own nature as it has melted into your understanding, into the essence that is pouring upon yourself, and that it is you yourself that can be close to the understanding of a perfect essence. I tell you, people, at this instant, blessed are you, the few portion of hearts that have gathered in this my house, blessed prayer, where I can gather you to be close to you. And at this instant I prepare high mountains and low roads, all places on earth, where your own nature has been recrystallized and melted into great postulates. I prepare and bless them, prisons and prisons, all places of the earth as enclosures of knowledge for that small creation, to which I illustrate you on the way, nourishing your great wisdom in my perfect essence. Caverns of darkness, places of the earth where the evil spirit itself has melted in the woman and in the man of the whole terrestrial plane. I prepare the man ruler of the entire universe, so that once again my elements, which I have been preparing through the years. My elements are and consist of the very essence of nature itself, the elements that are indeed preparing themselves more and more, so that man who has recreated himself without meditating 5 minutes will hear and behold the movements of the remote elements that are preparing themselves, plagues prepared as at that time, that are preparing themselves, so that he can behold the man of the earth on this earth plane, as indeed the time will come when a locust will be able to eat the man of the earth. The elements that will indeed have to appear through time, for indeed the selfishness and the envy and that imperialism that exists on the earth plane will have to be fulfilled to the letter, because it is indeed written, with a great wisdom of the essence that melts in the mind of a human being. But behold, your own mind will be able to bend and melt just by meditating 5 minutes and contemplating that any of the elements you will be able to dominate it with your own mind. I prepare everything equally, from the greatest to the least. I prepare with my mighty hand, the Son and the Holy Spirit. It is done, hearts, because you have prepared yourself to reach this lintel, where your own plant is preparing and leading itself to the furthest corners of this earthly plane, that you yourself are the one who will also be able to reach the beyond. This is one of my teachings that I come to deliver to you. End of transcription. Don Florencio's concept of reality. As I already mentioned, Don Florencio holds the idea that there are conscious beings, spiritual in another dimension, with whom it is possible to communicate after undergoing proper training. This training is called development and stimulates the capacity of detachment or separation of the body and the spirit. Behind the spiritual beings and sustaining the spirits is what the lineage of Don Florencio Hama calls the essence. This is common to all beings, which differ from each other, depending on their closeness or remoteness with respect to that essence. In the conception of this autochthonous psychologist, bodily death does not necessarily entail the death of the spirit. The spirit survives and reincarnates in another body and another brain, which Don Florencio calls apparatus. The survival of the spirit depends on its works. Some of Don Florencio's own comments were transcribed from a recording he made in the author's company, which I reproduce below. Don Florencio, are they working on the temple? Yes. And when are they in the temple? Tomorrow I have to work. Tomorrow, Sunday. And do you teach? Yes, I do. What time? At 10 a.m., 10:30 at the latest. And on Tuesday, healing work. You do healing work on Tuesday? You also do healing work. Wednesday is an advice that is given on the first Wednesday of each month. A counsel is given, that is, spiritual science comes to the counsel, to the humanity that is listening. But this advice is for the enlightenment of the people. But what is the difference between the chair and the counsel? Oh yes, it is very different. The advice is given by a spiritual being, for example, Castor, red skin, blue feather. Does blue feather follow? Yes, of course, of course. There is Benjamin of the jungle, other tribes. Now we have discovered the giants. Giants? Yes, you haven't noticed that. Yes, because at that time the giants were predominant in Noah's time. We have been finding that the giants did a lot of harm to mankind. They were very big men, over 6 feet and very strong, and the low people threatened them very much. And history, the Old Testament, tells us that Noah was already beginning to talk to them about the flood, and the flood came, and they were all lost. But before that, they overpowered a certain David. No, Goliath. Yes, Goliath. David was the one who killed him, and we had not discovered him. It was a spiritual being, Castor, who discovered him. But are those giants still around? No, not anymore, but we are investigating that those giants prevailed at that time. We have investigated by means of spiritual beings, and by means of the papyrus. The papyrus? Yes, the papyrus, that is, the newspaper. Ah, it coincides with what the spiritual beings say. Exactly. What do you feel when a spiritual being comes to you, when he gives a lecture? Yes, let's talk about that. I would like you to realize that. When I go to work, I don't eat anything. Just a coffee and a piece of bread in the morning at breakfast time, and then I go to work. And when I get to work, I don't have to do anything material. I arrive, I sit down for a while. Since it is time, I go to the place. When I arrive there, I begin to meditate, and when I am meditating, my mind begins to clear, and I no longer remember anything. Everything goes away. I no longer think anything. There is already something material, and already a mentality comes to me. I don't know from where. Then when the one who is going to make the apparition and the prayer begins to appear, then it is something like a word, arriving that is already giving me in my mind what I am going to say. But that happens. Then I feel that something comes and focuses in my mind, and I feel sleepy. That dream starts to dominate me. Then what I have to do is to prepare myself very well, and I start. Suddenly my mind goes away, and you feel who it is, and it kind of lifts you up, and you are about 1.5 meters away, and then something comes. Lights come here and there. Colored lights? No, white. Then I feel like I'm being penetrated. There is still something that people are talking about. Pretend you're talking 100 meters away. You hear a little noise, but you're gone. You're like a statue. And it is as if a radio is saying, say this, say this, say this. This is what you are going to be talking about. When the other one is already where your prayer is, you are already concentrated. Pretend that you are already concentrated. But do you feel yourself? No, not anymore. You feel that you are an apparatus that is transmitting. But do you remember what it says? No, nothing. You don't remember anything when you come out of it. You don't remember anything. No, nothing. You don't know anything. You're like drunk, stunned. You don't know anything about the professorship. You don't know anything. You just remember that you were working for 2 or 3 hours, you were asleep. And then humanity tells you what the lecture was about, what the teaching was. And you, when you are asleep, where do you go? No, you don't feel anything. You don't feel anything. You pretend you fall asleep. You don't know what the lecture was about. Then it is something strange because they ask you, you said this, but I don't know, and there are people who don't believe, who think that you do know what you said. Then everybody asks you, and you don't know. Then you go through, it can take half an hour. That's what I've seen with the clock. Who is the one who connects with you? Is it always the same one? No, they are different. Does it change every time you give a lecture? Yes, I'm going to tell you why. Do you know why? Because I've seen devices that we call priests. What are these devices? The mind. The mind is our apparatus. For example, I am not the one who goes to work, it is someone else who goes to work. So I have seen apparatuses that always deliver the same lectures. And is the chair the same? It is the same. For example, the first Sunday it delivers a lecture with a message, and the next Sunday it delivers the same one again, and the third Sunday it delivers the same one again. So this apparatus for me, on my capacity to reach, I think it has learned with materiality. Do you know what materiality is? Yes. I mean, you've kind of learned a speech. So you already know it, and you are always repeating it. That means that this device does not change. Now I am going to tell you something. This is a green needle. So I want you to know, so that you are more aware of it. When I went to Mexico, to the matrix center of the whole doctrine, as we call it. Where is it? Neptuno number 22 in the Guerrero neighborhood. Well, I went to receive there. I was developing 10 years, in Mexico, sometimes there in Mexico, sometimes here. When I graduated, I didn't even want to go, I was afraid. They gave me tests and I thought, they're going to say I'm no good. You know what? I feel that there is a being here. Yes, there is, but very strong. Yes, of course there is. So I thought so, but the first time I didn't want to go. Because there are many well-prepared faculties there. It is the main center. It is a real school. That is, it is a university. There is a lot of work and I did not want to go. 3 months went by and they insisted again, and I didn't want to go. I felt I was not going to make the grade. But before that I had gone to work one day, and a brother came and told me, "Look, I'm coming to see you." The doctor, being the director, was in charge of 23 doctors. He was a certain Dr. Gustavo Delgado in Baja California. And one day a student who was sick arrived. The doctors got together and they were not able to provide care. So I gave the stitch. What is stitching? We found out what the student had. A part of his spinal column was just crashed. It was just crashed. We located the damage that the boy had. Then the doctor immediately ordered the intervention to be performed. 20 days after I returned, the boy was already back in the university. He was healthy. That's when I got over my fear and I said, now I feel I am capable. After 10 or 12 days they told me, we want you to go and consecrate yourself. And I told them, well, yes, it seems that now I can. And I told the guys, if I don't give a stitch, if I can't solve the tests, I'm out. And I was able to. They passed me on to the higher levels, and I passed them. What do you mean? Higher seances. It was when there was a chair, and you were sitting there watching all the evolution as if you were watching television. And I gave the key to everything that the essence delivered. So you connected with the essence. Yes, I gave the key and everything. Then the master called me and told me, you are very well now. It is the moment of your consecration. And then he gave me my diploma. From here you have to be prepared to deliver the essence of the essences. So that's how I was until I was 10 years old. In any of those 10 years did you stop your preparation? No, from that time on I continued, as if I had gone to school. When the faculties didn't come to me, I went to Yautepec. And how do you see Mr. Campos here? Well, he is way behind to do one of these internships. He should not drink, and he drinks a lot. There are 2 ladies who half know how, but when they can no longer cure people, they send them to me. So I have gone through a very strong crisis because they come without strength. But do you belong to the temple? That is my cradle. And the people who were developing, for example, Don Ramiro's daughter. No, not her anymore. They still go on, but these people go without the value of the gift. As they do not trust, they cannot reach. There are about 5 women who have given up and they don't go consecutively. They don't reach it. Have they detached? Has the being already penetrated them? Yes, a developed being, so if it stops going for a month. And what days is that? Mondays and Wednesdays. And you develop them. I have already started. They are massaged so that they are soft for when the current comes, with very precious development, and it is guided by means of a little device. That is when you are already connected. Do you know what just happened to me? I was feeling a very strong being. It came into me, yes, I saw it. You saw it? You know who it was. It's your protector. He may be, but if not, he is a protector who always protects you. And do you know who he is? Well, more or less. For me, the being that protects you is Makajwatl. Makazawatl? Yes, Makajwatl. He is a very intelligent and very good being. And where is he from? Well, we move on. What do you call essence? Essence for us, we say it is a being, a God that we don't know. But is it a being, or is it pure consciousness? Well, for us we say it is a being, but we don't know it, but we feel that it comes to us, and it is what protects us. But is it always the same essence? Well, the same essence, but there are different versions. It is the one we talked about before. When it is always delivering the same device, it is not intelligent. What? Is there an imposition? Exactly, you hit the key, but when the device is delivering, each lecture is different. Hey, those temples that are in Yautepec, Tecolopan, in Mexico City, do they have the same organization? Is there Pedro? Is there a guide, a guardian? How is that? Well, the guide, let's say there are 3 of us. Are there other guides? No, one is a guide. Another one is Peter, and one is a guardian. Then we are going to set up a place where we are going to do a meditation, which is that prayer, and elevation is done. Then come the others, the faculties that begin to develop. Those are the faculties, those that receive the essence, Andale. But who is the guide? Is he the one who develops? The guide is the one who is going to develop them, the one who commands them, the one who organizes, the one who does everything in the future. And what does the guardian do? Well, the guardian is one of the main bases. He is the one who takes care that everything goes well inside the enclosure. You are the guardian, you take care that everything goes well. I have to see if someone goes and wants to develop and is developing badly. Then I say how he should develop. I am the guardian for a reason. Because the capacity has been granted to me developing, reaching through my work. That is why I am the guardian. And then come the faculties, and the columns. What are the columns? The columns are the ones that go back and forth in the middle, so that people don't fall asleep. When people fall asleep, the devil is feasting on the person. The devil does not want us to listen to the words of God. The devil is precisely the one who became the giants. According to us, this is how knowledge is. It is believed because when there are good things, someone comes and breaks things down. This is the devil himself. For example, the companion, at times something enters his spirit. He searches like crazy, he has bad thoughts, he has bad moods. That is the devil himself. And the person who is well controlled, who is meditating, that is the good person. We do not need God to come down from heaven. We do not know if the good man exists or not. I believe that one is responsible. You can be your own God. That's the key. You are responsible. And the essence, do you believe that the essence is in you, or is it another being? No, it is not in you. If you are good, you have good hunches, good things. You know how to bring people together. You have understanding. It is the essence itself. But in your development, do you think you take it to yourself or do you take it to other beings? At the beginning, I thought that my developments did not come from myself. So I thought, but when I was training, I thought that it is very close to our heart, to our cells, to our mind that is working in our thinking. It is the same. We do serve as means. It is for ourselves. Exactly. Not for any other being. Even if a being gets in. But what's this about a being getting in? Our mind is the good thought, the divine meditation that exists in us, that enters us. And it is the one that gives good accounts. And what is that of Pluna Blanca, Gacela? Well, they are the tribes that were divided when the pharaohs, 2 great sages. But for example, is Benjamin of the jungle a different being? Yes, of course. But the essence is the same? Yes, it is the same, except that it is distinguished by the tribes. But the essence is in everything. For example, Benjamin of the jungle and a being who has reached the essence. If he has reached the essence, he has more wisdom. In other spiritual places, houses of prayer, they say that those spiritual beings, that spiritual childhood, have the desire to evolve. Well, if one wants, if one has the desire to evolve. The end. If you liked this audiobook, share it with the people you appreciate the most. Thank you for following the channel Bending Realities. A big hug, and may the infinite wisdom of the Creator guide you always.